Chapter 12. The IWW in the Post-War Years. In September 1917, as we have seen in our previous volume, secret agents of the Department of Justice raided and occupied the offices of the industrial workers of the world all over the United States. On the basis of thousands of seized documents, prosecutions against IWW members were begun in Illinois, California, and Kansas. In Chicago alone, over 100 Wobblies were arrested, jailed, and tried in the federal court. Their conviction was a foregone conclusion, and as expected, the jury found 93 of them guilty of violating the Federal Espionage Act. Judge Kennesaw Mound Toyne Landis imposed heavy fines and prison sentences, as drastic, in a number of cases, as 20 years in a federal penitentiary and $30,000 in fines. After the Chicago co-defendants were found guilty, the government's battle against the IWW shifted to trials in Sacramento, California, and Wichita, Kansas. The Sacramento trial. On December 17, 1917, an explosion occurred in the official residence of the governor of California in Sacramento. Little damage resulted, and although the identity of the men who had planted the bomb was not known, Sacramento's chief of police Ira Concoran blamed the IWW. The police chief could give no justification for his belief, but then William Hood, an IWW member, was accidentally discovered trying to ship several sticks of dynamite by express. He planned to use them on a mining trip, he claimed. Hood was arrested for illegal shipment of explosives, and George F. Voter, who was with him in the express office, was also arrested. 2. On the basis of the prevailing anti-IWW hysteria of the time, arrests were made throughout California. On January 19, 1918, the police. The IWW in the post-war years 209 rounded up 53 men in and around the IWW Hall in Sacramento, suppos Edley for questioning in the dynamite case. Free Don S. Rathkin, special agent of the Department of Justice, let it be known that there was insufficient evidence to hold any of the arrested men and that he would not undertake, in behalf of his department, to make further investigation and to order the men held pending results. 4. But the city commissioners of Sacramento rejected this viewpoint, and the 53 men already arrested continued to be held in jail. In fact, Governor Stevens, the sheriff, and the chief of police all sent a protest to Washington denouncing Agent Rathkin's attitude. 5. Early in February 1918, the federal grand jury in Sacramento indicted 54 male and 1 female wobbly, Theodora Pollock. The male prisoners were thrown into a common cell 21 feet square. Some had to remain standing while others reclined. One of the prisoners described the food as consisting of 2 ounces of mush in the morning, less than 2 ounces of bread, and at night 3 fetid little smelts and less than 2 ounces of potatoes, with coffee, twice. The prisoners claimed that they gave their own money to the guards to buy food, but then the purchases were placed just beyond their reach to tantalize them. 6. 5 prisoners died before the trial opened on December 13, 1918. A number of those originally arrested were freed, but 46 were indicted on 4 counts. They had been charged originally with conspiring to oppress employers throughout the United States, but the indictments were changed to the same ones that had been used to convict the IWW members in the Chicago cases. The first count charged interference with the government's war activities by means of strikes accompanied by acts of violence. The second, third, and fourth counts charged conspiracy to intimidate persons not to fulfill contracts and to refuse to register for military service. The defendants were also charged with causing insubordination in the military and naval forces, and with using the mails to cheat and defraud employers. 7. All attempts to prepare a defense for the prisoners were frustrated. Several members of the defense committee were arrested. Its secretary was arrested 15 times in 4 months, and the wobbly directly in charge of defense work was arrested and held incommunicado for 8 months. All mail coming into and going out of prison was censored. 8. After their comrades in Chicago had been convicted and sentenced to long prison terms, most of the prisoners in California became convinced that the existing hysterical climate would render an ordinary legal defense useless. They decided on a method which they believed might rally support from the working class and win them an early release after they had been convicted and sentenced. 43 of the 46 defendants decided to offer no. 210. Post-War Struggles. 1918 to 1920 Defense. Mortimer Downing, spokesman for the Silent Defenders, explained, "We decided upon the silent defense because we despair of justice for the working men being achieved through the courts. The Mooney case, the Frank Little incident, the Bisbee cases, the Chicago trials, these have convinced us of the uselessness of legal defense. We are tried in a prejudiced community. Some of our men have been held incommunicado. They have been prevented by United States agents from mailing courteous appeals to the court. Some of them have been confined, untried, for a year. These conditions are intolerable, and this silent strike is to preserve the self-respect of ourselves as members of organized labor." 9. It has been argued that the California defendants committed a fatal error in following this type of defense, or lack of it. The prosecution, it has been noted, did not claim that these men had committed any overt acts, but contended merely that they had conspired to commit such acts. Accordingly, Hyman Weintraub maintains, the defendants, by acting in concert on a silent defense, by being tried en masse, lent credence to the prosecution's story that all the defendants were tied together in an attempt to sabotage the government. By their unanimous silence, they helped to convict themselves. 10. There is some validity in this analysis. Although the distinction between acting and conspiring to act meant little in the existing anti-IWW hysteria, it is true that the task of the prosecution was made easier by the fact that there was no effort to contradict its evidence by those defendants who chose the silent defense. Moreover, the court was able to allow the introduction of evidence antedating the period in which the alleged conspiracy took place, as long as testimony was also introduced to show that the conspiracy existed during the time the so-called offense was committed. Letters and pamphlets going back to the beginning of the IWW in 1905 were allowed as evidence on the ground that they would show the existence of a conspiracy. 1-1. On January 16, after only 70 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict finding the 46 defendants guilty as charged. On the average, less than 2 minutes were spent in considering the guilt of each defendant. Judge Frank H. Rudkin asked the prisoners if they had anything to say. After having sat silently for almost a month and a half, a number of the defendants decided to speak out. Frank Esmond, weak and ill after 10 months in jail, said, "The Mooney, Frank Little, and Bisbee episodes are discussed in Foner, History of the Labor Movement in the United States, Volume 7. The IWW in the Post-War Years 211. I am not asking for mercy. I'll take neither mercy nor pity from you or any other representative of this government. I want to go on record for myself and the organization as saying that we, the outcasts, have been framed up, clubbed, beaten, slugged, martyred and murdered. Is it any wonder that I do not consider myself bound by your procedure when this court and its proceedings are a disgrace to the United States? You have done more than any JWW could possibly do to drag your stars and stripes through the mire." 12. Mortimer Downing, speaking, to get a few things off our chests, defended the philosophy of the IWW. The JWW has taught and will continue to teach that the worker on the job shall tell the boss when and where he shall work, how long, for what wages and under what conditions. It will continue to teach that gradually the worker will get more and more power until finally he will take over the industries. 13. The next day, the defendants were sentenced. Theodora Pollock was fined $100, and the other 2 defendants who were represented by counsel were sentenced to 2 months each in jail. The remaining 43 received prison sentences ranging from 1 to 10 years, which were upheld by the state Supreme Court. 14. The Wichita Trial. On November 17, 1917, Fred Robertson, United States Attorney for Kansas, working closely with oil company detectives, arranged for federal agents to seize IWW literature and letters at the union halls of the oil field. Workers Industrial Union No. 450 in Augusta, Kansas and Drumright, Oklahoma. More than 40 Wobblies were arrested. 15 Caroline A. Lowe, attorney for the IWW, charged that the Wobblies were arrested on John Doe warrants issued in Butler County, Kansas, at the suggestion of agents of the Carter Oil Company, the Sinclair Oil Company, Gypsy Oil Company and other oil companies doing business in this section of the country. 1632 Wobblies were eventually selected for trial. Robertson conceded privately that he did not have a strong case, but we are going to give them a run for their money. 17. This consisted largely of releases to the press intended to further inflame the atmosphere against the men scheduled for trial. At regularly scheduled press conferences, Robertson told reporters that many members of the IWW consider the strike situation in Seattle to be a product of the general strike seed sown by the IWW in 1917, when Seattle was the hotbed of IWW draft resistors. The government, he continued, would show numerous exchanges of ideas between the Pacific Slope IWW and 60 Bolsheviki who embarked. 212. Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920 from Seattle with the IWW propaganda mission to Petrograd, and scores of interviews, promises and exhortations along with encouragements for the Bolsheviki had been collected. Robertson quoted from a document that he claimed was issued by the IWW and which contained the statement, "But we realize we must call a general strike for more than the city of Seattle." The IMF location was that the IWW was responsible for the Seattle General Strike. 1. Based on material furnished by Robertson, the Kansas City, Kansas Star of March 19, 1919 presented the nature of testimony that would be offered by the prosecution. Documents would be shown to the jury decorated with emblems of the black cat and wooden shoe, which were described as the official emblems of the IWW, and signified sabotage, the chief weapon of the IWW in their plan to overthrow the present organization of things, politically and industrially in the United States. The documents had been seized during a raid by government agents of IWW headquarters in the Kansas oil fields, and included letterheads of the Agricultural Workers Organization and Oil Workers Union No. 400, which was the branch of the order to which the members belong who are now on trial in Wichita. As a body, the Star observed, the general strike is the weapon of the IWW at all times. But for the individual members always and everywhere, the black cat and the wooden shoe sabotage are chief weapons. What does this mean? The paper asked. It answered that it meant that the harvest, wheat and oil production of Kansas were doomed by the scab cat, the IWW term for the black cat, unless the men on trial were found guilty and put away. Knowing that if these men were imprisoned all problems with the IWW would not necessarily cease, mayors, city attorneys, and police chiefs from more than 20 towns in the Kansas Wheat Belt met on May 2, 1919 at Hutchinson, Kansas and issued the warning that IWW members will find western Kansas unhealthy this summer. A major point stressed was that the Wobblies demand higher than standard wages, and the scale of their demands keeps pace with the advance in prices as the season progresses. 19. A Wichita grand jury returned an indictment against 25 Wobblies in March 1918, charging the men with conspiracy, but the defense succeeded in having the indictment quashed twice. The government then obtained an indictment that was upheld in the courts. But the trial was delayed when the National Civil Liberties Bureau brought a complaint to the Justice Department about intolerable conditions for the prisoners in the Sedgwick County Jail in Wichita, conditions so terrible that Stephen Shuren, one of the IWW in the post-war years 213 the defendants, cut his throat from ear to ear in a fit of depression over continued imprisonment in those circumstances. After considerable pressure, Judge Pollock ordered an investigation of the Sedgwick County Jail and found it unfit for prisoners. 20. The indictment contained 5 counts. The Wobblies were charged with entering into a conspiracy to violate, hinder and delay I. The General Declaration of War with Germany. 2. The proclamations and regulations of the President of the United States governing the conduct, treatment and disposition of alien enemies. 3. The Act of Congress to increase the military establishment of the United States. 4. The Act to increase the Signal Corps of the Army and to purchase, manufacture, repair, maintain and operate airships. S. The Act of Congress to provide for the national security by encouraging the production, conserving the supply and continuing the distribution of food supplies. 6. The General Laws of the United States. 21. The first 4 counts were similar to the charges against the Chicago and Sacramento defendants. The 5th count was new. It added to the charge of conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act a violation of the Lever Act, a law relating to the distribution of food and fuel products. Thus the defendants were charged with conspiracy to limit the production and transportation of petroleum and farm products. The indictment listed no specific instance of such interference with the production of food or fuel, but it did cite The Harvest War Song by Pat Brennan in the IWW's Little Red Songbook, which contains the words, "Zero up goes machine," if John Farmer did not meet the Wobblies' demands 00 wages. The trial began in Wichita on December 1, 1918. As expected, a major portion of the prosecution's case was presented through seized IWW leader Atcher and letters. As in the indictment, the prosecution drew attention to songs in the Little Red Songbook that suggested sabotage of Farmer's machinery. If Farmer John Don pleases, his machine will visit Jesus. After a week of testimony and cross-examination, the prosecution rested. The defendants then voted not to present any evidence. The Ray sons were never explained, but it seems that they believed, particularly for a description of the terrible conditions in the jail, see Earl B. White, The Wichita Indictments and Trial of the IWWJ, 1917 to 1919, and the Aftermath, Ph.D. dissertation. University of Colorado at Boulder, 1980. 214. Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920 after Chicago and Sacramento, that their cause was hopeless and that the funds were exhausted and we could not put on a defense in this case prop early. 22. The jury deliberated for 20 hours and found all 27 defendants guilty. 26 were sentenced to terms ranging from 1 to 9 years. 1, who had joined the IWW by mistake, received a sentence of 1 day. 23 on December 19, 1918, the Wobblies boarded a special interurban car and, singing their favorite songs from the Little Red Songbook, rode to the Leavenworth Penitentiary. The Kansas City Journal hailed the verdict on its front page. Americanism triumphant. Long live Americanism. Anarchists outlawed forever. The welcome on Uncle Sam's doormat eternally erased for all IWW. 24. In his study of the Wichita case, Earl Bruce White points out, the Wichita prosecution is different from other IWW cases because it was the only successful federal prosecution specifically directed against the IWW's concept of industrial unionism. The defendants were in the midst of an organizing campaign in the Mid-Continental oil field when they were arrested. After the Wichita convictions, the state obtained a permanent injunction prohibiting the Agricultural Workers Industrial Union Number 400, AWIU, and the Oil Workers Industrial Union Number 450, OWIU, from operating in the state. 25. Centralia. By mid-1919, the condition of the IWW was desperate. Legal battles had left it financially destitute, most of its leadership imprisoned, and its organizing campaigns were faltering. Then, in November 1919, a tragic event occurred in Centralia, Washington that further weakened the organization. In the fall of 1916, a committee of Centralia townspeople had forcibly escorted a group of IWW members to the county line and warned them never to return. 6. Undaunted, the WW opened another hall in Centralia in the spring of 1918. During a Red Cross parade on April 30, 1918, the hall was raided by a group of businessmen, and the building in which it was located was almost demolished. Some captured Wobblies were taken out of town in trucks, beaten, dumped into a ditch and again warned never to return. 27. In June 1919, a group of businessmen, in broad daylight, raided a newsstand operated by a blind vendor named Tom Lassiter because he sold the IWW in the post-war years. 215. Seattle Union Record and the IWW Industrial Worker. When Lassiter continued his operation, a group of vigilantes seized him at his stand, drove him out of town, dumped him into a ditch at the county line, and warned him never to return. The Seattle Union Record protested against this treatment, but no one was ever prosecuted. 28. Following Lassiter's forcible deportation, G. F. Russell, secretary of the Washington Employers Association and president of a local lumber company, called a group of businessmen together at the Chamber of Commerce. At this meeting, the Citizens Protective League was formed, and F. B. Hubbard, president of the Eastern Railway and Lumber Company, was selected to lead the organization. Its declared purpose was to deal with the IWW. 29. When the IWW opened another hall in Centralia in September 1919, the Citizens Protective League decided to take action. The League met on the night of October 20 with the stated and published objective of getting rid of the Wobblies. Its leader was reported to have become highly incensed when the Centralia chief of police told him that there was no law under which he could drive the organization out of the city, and that the IWW had a right to remain in Centralia. The League's response was that it would take direct action to get rid of the IWW, and it was assured by the same chief of police that he did not believe any jury would be obtained that would find those taking part in a raid on the IWW hall guilty of violating the law. 30. When a trade union representative refused to serve on the League's committee to oust the IWW, a secret committee was appointed composed of employers, businessmen, and American Legion officials. 31. The line of march of the American Legion's Armistice Day Parade was then announced. It was to pass twice by the IWW hall. The IWW expected a raid, and Mrs. J. G. McAllister, who owned the hotel in which the IWW hall was located, appealed to the police for protection of her property. In addition, Elmer Smith, the IWW attorney, traveled to Olympia to seek protection from the governor. But neither of them obtained satisfaction. The chief of police told Mrs. McAllister that there were not enough police in Centralia to stop the marchers if they intended to raid the hall. The governor refused even to see Smith. 32. Smith told the Wobblies that they had a legal right to defend their lives and property, with force if necessary, if they could not secure protection from the law enforcement authorities. 33. In an effort to ward off violence, the IWW distributed copies of a circular in Centralia that read 216. Postwar Struggles, 1918-1920. To the citizens of Centralia. We must appeal to the law-abiding citizens of Centralia and to the working class in general. We beg of you to read and carefully consider the following. The profiteering class of Centralia have of late been waving the flag of our country in an endeavor to incite the lawless element of our city to raid our hall and club us out of town. For this purpose, they have inspired editorials in the Hub, falsely and viciously attacking the IWW, hoping to gain public approval for such revolting criminality. Those profiteers are holding numerous secret meetings to that end, and covertly inciting returned servicemen to do their bid. 34 milligrams. The Centralia Hub called repeatedly for the use of whatever force was necessary to oust the IWW from the city, openly charging that the Wobblies were worse than the Germans. 35. But the local AFL Trades Council tried to prevent the inevitable attack on the IWW hall. Vice President William Dunning informed Warren Zero Grimm, the new commander of the American Legion, that the labor unions strongly disapproved of the lawlessness being planned, but the protest had no effect. 36. Anticipating a raid and believing they had a right to defend their property, the Wobblies prepared to do so. Britt Smith, secretary of the local IWW, Wesley Everest, Ray Becker, James McInerney, and other Wobblies were gathered in the hall. Lauren Roberts, Bert Bland, and Ole Hansen were stationed in Seminary Hall to the east. 0. C. Bland and John Lamb were in the Arnold Hotel, and John Doe Davis was in the Avalon Hotel on the opposite side of the street. The Armistice Day Parade began at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon with the Centralia Legionnaires leading the march. They walked up Tower Street past the IWW Hall. About a block north of the hall, at 3rd Street, the marchers halted, turned, and marched back. As they passed by the IWW Hall for the second time, some of them broke ranks and charged toward the door of the hall. The entire Centralia platoon then broke formation and surged toward the door. They kicked in the door, shattered the windows, and eagerly sought to crowd into the hall. Rifle and revolver shots rang out from inside the hall, from Seminary Hall, and from the Avalon and Arnold hotels. Grimm, who had been leading the parade, was shot in the abdomen and staggered into the street where he died. Arthur McElfresh, shot in the head, died almost immediately. Sen Casagrande was fatally wounded as he tried to flee. Several other paraders suffered minor wounds. The enraged legionnaires rushed into the hall, wrecked it, and dragged the IWW in the post-war years. 217 Several IWWers out of the large unused icebox at the rear of the hall. One of the Wobblies, Wesley Everest, an ex-serviceman, escaped and fled down an alley, firing his Colt .45 at his pursuers as he went. Everest reached the Sukanchuk River, which he tried to ford, but he found it too deep and its current too swift. He returned to its bank, and as he waited there, Dave Hubbard, nephew of F. B. Hubbard, rushed toward him and ordered him to drop his revolver and give himself up. Everest shouted that he would surrender to an officer of the law but not to the mob. He ordered Hubbard to stay where he was. Hubbard charged and Everest fired, killing Hubbard instantly. His revolver empty, Everest was seized by the mob, his teeth were knocked out and he was dragged to the Centralia jail. In front of the jail, the legionnaires tied a rope around his neck and threatened to lynch him. "You haven't got the guts to lynch a man in the daylight," Everest said through his bloody lips, defying the mob. 37. At 8 o'clock that night, the lights of Centralia went out for about 15 minutes. During this brief period of darkness, the handful of guards at the city jail surrendered Everest to a small mob. "Tell the boys I died for my class," Everest said as the men dragged him from his cell. 38. The lynchers threw Everest into a car, drove to a railroad trestle over the Chehalis River, and as the car sped to the selected spot, some of the lynchers castrated him. At the trestle, they hanged him, illuminating their work with automobile headlights. Before he died, the lynchers pulled the body back up, and after tying a longer rope to his neck, dropped him over again. Then they riddled the swaying body with rifle bullets. The following morning someone cut the rope and Everest's body fell into the Chehalis River. County Coroner David Livingstone, who was president of the Citizens Protective League, led a posse to remove the body before Everest's friends could rescue the corpse and bury it. They dumped the mutilated body on the floor of the jail where the other Wobbly prisoners could see it. It lay there for 2 days. On November 15th, the deputies gave 4 imprisoned Wobblies shovels, took them to a field on the outskirts of town, and forced them to dig a grave into which Everest's body was flung. 39. The coroner's report, presented by Livingstone, remains a classic of its kind. Everest, the coroner declared, had broken out of jail, fled to the river, tied the knot around his neck and jumped off the trestle. Failing to kill himself, he had climbed back up, replaced the rope with a longer one, and jumped again. He then shot himself several times, and finally, after cutting the rope, he drowned in the river. 40. Everest's lynching was defended as the rough and ready practice of the 218 Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920 Old Time Vigilance Committee. But it was justice. 41 Ralph Chaplin's poem on Wesley Everest put it quite differently. 1 BM and defiant as a wind-lashed reed, hounded he faced you as he stood at bay. LBU dared not lynch him in the light of day. But on your dungeon stones you let him bleed. Night came, and you, black vigilante of greed, like human wolves, seized hard upon your prey, 1 BRTURED and killed, and silently slunk away. Without one qualm of horror at the deed. Once, long ago, do you remember how you hailed him king for soldiers to deride? LBU placed a scroll above his bleeding brow, and spat upon him, scourged him, crucified. A rebel unto Caesar then as now, alone, thorn crowned, a spear wound in his side. 42. Mobs gathered outside the city jail, threatening to lynch the Wobbly prisoners, cursing, blaring auto horns, flashing lights into the darkened jail windows, throwing missiles through the windows and pushing loaded guns through the bars. The terror continued for 9 consecutive nights. In the Co.D. November nights, there were neither mattresses nor blankets for the prisoners. It is hardly surprising that in this hellish environment, Lauren Roberts, a youngster of 19, was found insane. 43. Meanwhile, Legionnaire posses searched the countryside for Wobblies who might have been in Centralia on Armistice Day and escaped. In their haste, the posses picked up anyone who looked suspicious. A posse shot and killed John Haney, who turned out to be a posse member looking for Wobblies. The Portland Oregonian reported at first that Haney had been slain in a skirmish with IWW suspects, but when the truth emerged, it was buried in an inside page and called an unfortunate accident. The legal authorities made no inquiry into Haney's death, and not even his 20-year-old son would call for one. "I don't blame you fellows," he was reported as saying in the Centralia Chronicle. "Don't think I do for a minute. It's tough to lose Dad, but you fellows did your duty." 44. Placards were mounted in shop windows throughout the area carrying the message. "Have you any information of the whereabouts of an IWW? Any person or persons having information, no matter of how little importance, concerning the whereabouts of a member of the IWW or any information whatever concerning the IWW in the post-war years. The outrage on Armistice Day will confer a favor on the city officials if they will call at once at the city hall and give whatever data they have to the chief of police. All information will be treated strictly confidential. Office open at 8:30. Come at once. 45,219. All but one of the Wobblies who had participated in the defense of the IWW hall were captured. But across the state more than 1,000 Wobblies were arrested, not to be tried for participating in the Centralia riot but under the newly enacted criminal syndicalist law. * 46. The Centralia Chronicle made it clear that it was not necessary to have been involved in the tragedy on Armistice Day to be summarily dealt with. Zero to even sympathize with the perpetrators of the tragedy is proof evident that the sympathizer is a traitor to his country. County prosecuting attorneys were called into session by State Attorney General C. Thompson and were advised to rush RWW cases through the courts as rapidly as possible, to try defendants en masse in order to save taxpayers' money and to ensure the maximum number of convict tie-ons. They were also urged to make certain that only courageous and patriotic jurors were chosen to hear the cases. 47. With very few exceptions, and those mainly in the radical and labor press, newspapers all over the United States reported that armed members of the RWW had deliberately fired into a Legionnaires' parade, killing 4 marchers. It was not murder, went one report. It was an attack on the American government. It was monumentally worse than either of these crimes. Lieutenant is rebellion. LT is treason. It was an attack on American sentiment, American honor, American traditions of right and wrong, American ideals of freedom, democracy and fair dealing. 48. Even Big A. Criminal syndicalism Bill J. was introduced into the 1917 legislative session in the state of Washington and passed both the House and Senate. The bill made it a felony to practice criminal syndicalism, which was defined as advocating crime, sabotage, or other unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform. But the passage of the bill outraged the labor movement in Washington, which viewed it as an attempt to destroy trade unions under the guise of attacking the IWW. Opponents of the Bill J flooded Governor Lister's office with their complaints and he was forced to veto the Bill J. In his veto message, the governor expressed concern over the bill's effect on loyal dissenters and said that he could only support a bill that would ensure their safety. 2 years later in the 1919 legislative session another, criminal syndicalism, bill was passed, and this time the governor signed it. Patrick Renshaw, The IWW and the Red Scare, 1917-1924, Journal of Contemporary History 3, 1968, 63-72, Dorothy N. Schmidt, Sedition and Criminal Syndicalism in the Senate of Washington, 1917-1919, M.A. Thesis, University of Washington, 1949, pp. 13-36. Seattle 7 Imes, February 24, 27, March 17, 1917. 220. Postwar Struggles, 1918-1920. Bill Haywood, who was out on bail in the Chicago trial, was fooled by the reports and was quoted as saying that the IWW did not condone murder and that the Wobblies involved, if guilty, should be punished to the limit. 49. A reflection of the prevalent hysteria was the arrest of the editor, the president, and the secretary of the board of directors of the Seattle Union Record and the shutting down of its press, on the ground that it had published an unpatriotic editorial that violated the Espionage Act. The editorial read, "Don't shoot in the dark. Violence begets violence. Anarchy calls forth anarchy." That is the answer to the Centralia outrage. And the reason for it is found in the constant stream of laudation in the kept press of un-American, illegal and violent physical attacks upon the person of those that disagree with the powers that be. The rioting which culminated in the death of 3 or 4 returned ex-servicemen in Centralia last night was the result of a long series of illegal acts by the men themselves, acts which no PR in the state was American enough to criticize except the Union Record. 5. The Union Record continued to publish on a rented press. In a noon extra edition on November 14, 1919, it reported that in the coroner's inquest over the death of the 4 Legionnaires, Drive, Frank Buford, one of the marchers in the Armistice Day parade, had testified that the Wobblies had fired only after the marchers had launched their attack upon the hall. Moreover, because of this and other similar testimony, the coroner's jury has failed to fix the blame for the shooting. 51. The Union Record also published the indictment of his fellow Legionnaires delivered by Commander Edward F. Bassett of the Silver Bow Post in Butte, Montana, who said, "The IWW in Centralia who fired upon the men that were attempting to raid the IWW headquarters there were fully justified in their act. Mob rule in this country must be stopped, and when mobs attack the home of a millionaire, when the case of Harry Alt, editor of the Seattle Union Record, charged with violating the Sedition Act, came to court in January 1920, the charges against him were dismissed for lack of evidence." Seattle Union Record, January 23, 1920. Since Alt was a champion of the Foner Labor Party and endorsed the party's candidates in the Seattle municipal election, many in Seattle believed that the real reason for the seizure of the paper was to suppress the political rights of labor. Hamilton Cravens, The Emergence of the Farmer Labor Party in Washington Politics, 1919-20, Pacific Northwest Quarterly 57, October, 1966, 152. The IWW in the post-war years 221 are of a laborer, or of the IWW. It is not only the right but the duty of the occupants to resist with every means within their power. If the officers of the law cannot stop these raids, perhaps the resistance of the raided may have that effect. 52. But the Seattle Tismays called on the government to ignore such views. There is but one effective answer to the methods employed by the IWW. It counseled. Terrorize the American BOLSHEVIKI, 53. 11 JWW members were indicted by the grand jury and charged with the murder of Warren Zero Grimm. Those not accused of the actual shooting were indicted on a charge of conspiracy to kill. Among the 11 was Elmer Smith, singled out because he had advised the Wobblies of their rights. 54. The trial. Since the Lewis County Bar Association had voted that none of its members should defend the Wobblies, the defendants had a difficult time obtaining local counsel. They finally had to call upon George Vanderveer, the longtime IWW lawyer, who came to Washington from Chicago just a few days before the trial. 55. The defense sought a change of venue and the trial was moved to Montesano in Grays Harbor County, a town of some 2,000 in which organized labor had little influence. Vanderveer asked for a second change of venue to Olympia or Tacoma, but Judge John M. Wilson rejected his plea. This was hardly surprising since Judge Wilson had delivered a eulogy for the slain Legionnaires and had denounced the IWW. 56. As his life was repeatedly threatened in Montesano, Vanderveer and his staff had to stay at a hotel in Aberdeen and travel some 20 miles each day to the scene of the trial. The trial itself, which opened on January 25, 1920, was marked by some astonishing irregularities. Some 50 Legionnaires attended, in uniform, occupying the front of the courtroom. They were paid $4 a day to attend, from a fund of $1,750 raised by the Legion among the employers, mostly lumber companies. The jurors later claimed in sworn affidavits that they had interpreted the presence of so many uniformed Legionnaires as a deliberate plan to intimidate them. 57. The other defendants included Eugene Barnett, a coal miner and member of both the IWW and the United Mine Workers. He was directly charged with the murder of Grimm. There were also Ray Becker, James McInerney, Bert Bland, Lauren Roberts, Zero C. Bland, Bert, Faulkner and John Lamb, all loggers, Britt Smith, IWW secretary, and Mike Sheehan, who was 64 AMD, a longtime union activist. Faulkner was also an ex-serviceman. Ole Hansen and John Doe Davis escaped and were not found. Tom Morgan, who was in the hall, unarmed, turned state's evidence and was not indicted. 222. Post-war struggles, 1918-1920. In addition, there was the presence of a troop of federal soldiers on the courthouse lawn. Vanderveer angrily protested their presence and demanded that Judge WTLSON order their immediate removal, but the judge, although at first angry because he had not been consulted, accepted the prosecution's explanation that the troops were needed to protect the court and the jurors if the 1WW descended on the town to free the prisoners. So the troops remained encamped on the courthouse lawn for the duration of the trial. 58. The case for the defendants was based on the argument that they had killed the Legionnaires in self-defense. They had defended their hall, as they were legally entitled to do. They had had every reason to fear violence from the Legion parade since the businessmen of Centralia and the Legion let it be known that they were conspiring to drive the Wobblies out of town and wreck their hall. The Wobblies had made efforts to secure police protection, and they had acted in self-defense only when attacked. The prosecution maintained that the 1WW had deliberately fired upon unsuspecting and peaceful marchers, and that the 1WW had planned the attack for days in advance of the parade. Since the Wobblies had conspired to attack the Legionnaires, they were severally guilty of murder. The fact that Grimm's body was found in the middle of the street was the reason the Wobblies were charged with his murder. Thus the prosecution could argue that the defendants shot at the marchers in the street and were not simply protecting themselves and their property. If the defendants had been charged with the murder of the others slain in the Armistice Day attack, whose bodies were found immediately in front of the 1WW hall, it might have been easier for the 1WW lawyer to prove that the shooting was in self-defense, especially since Judge Wilson refused to permit the introduction of evidence of self-defense unless the defense could prove an overt act on Grimm's part. 59. On the eve of and during the trial, a circular was distributed which insisted that it is the duty of every juror, as an American citizen, to cast his ballot for conviction and maximum punishment and thus sever a few heads of a many-headed monster that is eating at the heart and vitals of the nation. Centralia's Armistice Day victims fought to save. For a juror not to cast his ballot would be as traitorous an act as the Armistice Day massacre itself. R.O. Judge W. Utelson's conduct of the trial practically guaranteed that the jurors would respond in the manner called for in the leaflet. The IWW in the post-war years 223 aided in the conspiracy or in the raid upon the hall before the shooting began. When two witnesses testified that Grimm did attack the hall, they were arrested for perjury as they left the stand. Although the two were never prosecuted, the arrests intimidated other potential defense witnesses. 61. In his instructions to the jury, Judge Wilson ruled that the IWW had no legal ground for pleading self-defense, even if the Legionnaires had attacked first. He therefore advised the jury that it had to bring in verdicts of guilty either of murder in the first degree or murder in the second degree. A verdict acquitting the defendants might be entertained, but Wilson indicated that this was virtually impossible. 62. After 20 hours the jury found two of the defendants, Barnett and Lamb, guilty only of third-degree murder, Sheehan and Elmer Smith, not guilty, Lauren Roberts, insane at the time of the shooting, and the other defendants, guilty of murder in the second degree. Judge Wilson held this verdict to be inadmissible and sent the jury back. 2 hours later, it returned and this time found Barnett and Lamb guilty of second-degree murder along with the other defendants. The jury again acquitted Sheehan and Smith and again found Roberts insane. With this second verdict the jurors submitted a petition to the court, which they all signed, and which read, "We the undersigned jurors respectfully petition the court to extend leniency to the defendants whose names appear on the attached verdict." 63. Wilson ignored the recommendation for leniency and sentenced all the convicted Wobblies to the maximum sentence allowed under Washington. IAW 25 to 50 years in prison. 64. For all practical purposes this was condemnation to life imprisonment. An unofficial jury, composed of 6 labor men representing AFL unions in the Northwest, sat through the trial and reported its own verdict. The labor jury held that the defendants were not guilty, that there had been a conspiracy by the business interests of Centralia, that the hall was unlawfully raided, and that the defendants did not get a fair trial. 65. Vanderveer appealed the decision to the Washington Supreme Court. In his appeal Vanderveer noted, "A more senseless verdict is inconceivable. The function of a verdict is to decide the issues. The verdict decides no thing. Did the defendants conspire, or did they not? Yes, for otherwise they should have been acquitted. No, for otherwise they should have been convicted of murder in the first degree." On April 14, 1920, in an amazingly short time, the Supreme Court upheld the verdict and sustained all of Judge Wilson's rulings. 66. 224. Post-War Struggles, 1918 to 1920. The aftermath. Their immediate available legal remedies exhausted, the Centralia pre-oneers were transferred to the state penitentiary at Walla Walla and began to serve time in June 1921. Meanwhile, individuals and organizations had already begun to take up the cause of the prisoners. Leading the drive to free the men were the Centralia Publicity Committee of the IWW and the American Civil Liberties Union. From its Chicago and Seattle offices, the General Defense Committee of the IWW launched a vast propaganda campaign picturing the prisoners as victims of the lumber trust that controlled the state of Washington. Labor and religious leaders in Seattle formed the Centralia Liberation Committee and held mass meetings and demonstrations in several parts of the state, at which speakers from various parts of the country called for the governor of Washington to pardon the prisoners. 67. Although one governor after another refused, the campaign did bring some results. Most of the jurors signed affidavits admitting that they had believed the defendants to be innocent, and that they had agreed to the final verdict of guilty because of the hysteria that prevailed, and to protect themselves, and because some of the members of the jury had been in favor of hanging the defendants regardless of the evidence. Although some of the jurors worked tirelessly along with other interested RSONS for the release of the imprisoned men, their efforts were in vain. James McInerney was the first prisoner to be released. He died in the prison hospital on August 13, 1930. 7 days later, on August 20, 1930, Lauren Roberts became the first of the Centralia prisoners to be officially released. He was the defendant who had been adjudged guilty but criminally insane at the time of the shooting. A sanity hearing was granted, and Roberts was released in his own custody, 69. In 1931, the 10th anniversary of the Centralia imprisonment, the statutory minimum term was fulfilled. The parole board began formal deliberations on freeing the prisoners. One after another, the Centralia prisoners were released until in June 1933 only Ray Becker was left in prison. He refused, however, to accept a parole, declaring to the Penitentiary Parole Board in mid-1933, "To hell with a parole. I want a full and complete pardon, or nothing at all. I never was guilty of this crime. I was found guilty by a capitalist jury, and when the state of Washington saw fit to try me, an innocent man, and charge me with the crime of murder and find me guilty of the same, they can only readjust the matter, as far as I. NMIWW and NM Postwar years 225 am concerned, by granting me a full and unconditional pardon, 70. The plea was denied and Becker remained in prison. In 1936, the International Woodworkers of America, a progressive industrial union, established a Free Becker Committee to work for his freedom. After much maneuvering, on September 20, 1939, Governor Clarence D. Martin signed a decree commuting Becker's sentence to the time served 18 years and 3 months. Although not a full pardon, it was enough to satisfy Becker, 71. As Becker left prison, another political prisoner in California, Tom Mooney, also was released from a living death in prison. Both had been innocent and had paid a high price for their activity on behalf of American workers. California's governor, New Dealer Culbert Olson, released Mooney with an elaborate apology, something Governor Martin refused to offer Becker, 72. Internal dissension in the IWW. At the same time that the IWW was reeling under the avalanche of massive repression, it was further weakened by a series of internal crises, which hastened its decline. One of the first post-war controversies in the IWW revolved around the demands of the Philadelphia branch of the Marine Transport Workers, MTW, a leading IWW industrial union, that action be taken to protect that union's job control on the docks. Organized as a local in 1913, the Philadelphia branch of the MTW had by 1916 grown to a membership of 3,000 and had gained job control on the waterfront, operating a virtual closed shop. During the war, the United States Shipping Adjustment Board had even recognized the MTW as the bargaining agent for the Philadelphia longshoremen, 73. After the war, the Philadelphia branch raised its initiation fee to $15 in order to keep its job control in the face of discharged workers and ex-servicemen drifting onto the docks looking for work. The action of the Philadelphia branch violated two basic IWW tenets. First, the principle of the universal transfer of the Union card. A card from one port was sup for the early history of the Philadelphia branch of the Marine Transport Workers, see Philip S. Foner, History of the Labor Movement 4, New York, 1965, 35-40. This did not prevent the federal government from indicting and trying Benjamin Harrison Fletcher, the black leader of the Marine Transport Workers and an organizer of major importance of the Philadelphia branch, on the charge of violating the Espionage Act. Fletcher was found guilty with others at the Chicago trial and sentenced to 20 years in prison and $10,000 fine. 226. Post-war struggles, 1918-1920 posed to be good at all ports, but the higher initiation fee meant workers from other docks had to pay again to work in Philadelphia, and the fee applied to non-Wobblies as well as WW members. Secondly, it violated the tradition of opposition to high initiation fees. Indeed, both the 1919 and 1920 WW conventions had reaffirmed the constitutional provision that the initiation fee for entrance into any part of the organization should be no higher than $2.74. Then, in August 1920, another issue emerged when the Philadelphia group was accused by other IWWers of loading munitions for the White Russian General Wrangel, who was receiving Allied help in the Civil War against the Bolsheviks. This alleged breach of international labor solidarity was enough to cause the WW General Executive Board to suspend the Philadelphia branch. However, it was reinstated in October after protesting that its members were innocent and that the suspensions had come without a proper hearing. 75. Hardly had the Philadelphia group been cleared of charges and its suspension lifted than the issue of high initiation fees reappeared. Disdaining the IW's reaffirmation of its $2 limit, the Philadelphia branch not only refused to withdraw the $15 initiation fee but actually raised it to $25. This caused the Marine Transport Workers, the parent industrial union, to accuse the Philadelphia branch of being a craft union within the WW, and to note, "We always made it our duty to assail the fakers of the craft unions for charging prohibitive initiation fees, and here one of our own branches is practicing the very same thing." 76. Other groups in the IWW now began openly to criticize the General Executive Board for shirking its duty to force the Philadelphia branch to live up to the Constitution. 7. On December 1, 1920, the JEB again suspended the Philadelphia branch, this time for charging an unconstitutional initiation fee. Although the branch had its defenders, 78 delegates to the May 1921 convention of the WW voted to uphold the JEB in expelling the branch. For the third time in as many years, the convention voted to retain the $2 initiation fee throughout all sections of the WW. 79. Once again, the action taken against Philadelphia was soon reversed and the branch was quietly reinstated in October 192-1. The WW had other problems to deal with, and the Philadelphia situation flickered and died out in the face of these problems. 80. Moreover, during the summer of 1921, the WW made a number of gains on both coasts as a result of the unity between sailors and longshoremen. Asterisk in the glow of the successes of the asterisk discussed in our next volume. The IWW in the post-war years. 227. Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union, the Wobblies were ready to overlook the ideological errors of the Philadelphia branch. 81. Meanwhile, other developments were causing discussion and creating differences within the IWW. A major factor concerned the approach to the defense of Wobblies found guilty of violating the Espionage Act in the various federal and state trials, which we will discuss further. Once the Chicago federal trial was over, the Wobblies, who were British subjects, tried to invoke their British citizenship in order to mitigate the punitive sentences levied by Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. But these efforts failed. 82. Amid much discussion of whether it was in accord with JWW principles to seek individual or small group redress, or all stand together in solidarity regardless of the outcome. The British appeals were effectively subverted by English consular agents in the United States. In addition, the Anglo-Wobblies were harassed by American and British agents. In the end, they had to serve out their sentences and were then deported to England and Australia. 83. Big Bill Haywood. When the appeal on behalf of the defendants in the Chicago trial was filed with the Circuit Court of Appeals, Haywood and his co-defendants were released from prison on bond July 28, 1919. With the war over, there was some hope that the appellate court would reverse the convict tie-ons, but its decision affirmed the sentences, eliminating only the fines. 84. Another appeal was taken to the United States Supreme Court, while the defendants continued free on bail. Haywood still served as secretary of the General Defense Committee and succeeded in raising substantial sums for the committee. 85. However, he learned that there was little chance of a reversal by the Supreme Court and that he faced the prospect of returning to Leavenworth with a 20-year sentence. As he wrote later, I learned that President Harding was interviewed by Meyer London, socialist congressman from the state of New York, who was told by the president that the IWW members would be pardoned with the exception of Haywood, whom they were going to hold. 86. While the appeals were pending, the IWW received a lengthy letter from the Communist International in Moscow. It outlined the principles held in common by the IWW and the Communists and described how the Soviet state of workers and peasants was constructed. To Haywood, this Warren Gamaliel Harding, 1865–1923, was elected president in the election of 1920, running on the Republican ticket. His administration was notorious for corruption in what came to be known as the Harding scandals. 228. Postwar Struggles, 1918–1920 letter represented a momentous circumstance in my somewhat eventful life. He told Ralph Chaplin. Here is what we have been dreaming about. Here is the IWW all feathered out. He explained later. While it was addressed to the IWW as an organization, I felt, as I knew many other members did, that it was a tribute to ourselves, as each had helped to build this class-conscious movement. 87. In 1920, while still awaiting the outcome of his appeal to the Supreme Court, Haywood joined the Communist Party of the United States. Meanwhile, he was advised by friends that he should not return to prison, where his usefulness to the working class would be cut off. He was 52 years old, and he came to the conclusion that if he lived in the Soviet Union he could still do important work for the movement to which he had devoted his life. In the spring of 1921 he obtained passage out of New York, along with George Andreychine and Vladimir Lossev, two other Wobblies. He ended up in the Soviet Union, arriving in Moscow in May 1921. By failing to surrender to the federal authorities after the Supreme Court declined on April 1, 1921 to review the Chicago trial, Haywood and 8 of his co-defendants forfeited $80,000 in bail. When Haywood offered to return from the Soviet Union if the forfeited bail would be renewed to those who had posted it, the government refused. 8. There has been a great deal of disagreement over the impact on the IWW of Haywood's flight. Some historians have argued that after an initial wave of indignation within the organization, the membership soon set Tillett into an attempt to forget him. 8 others insist that Haywood's action left the IWW financially shattered and lacking in experienced, competent leadership, and that it intensified opposition among Wobblies to the Soviet Union, the Third International, Comintern, and the U.S. Communist movement. 90. Another effect was to strengthen the position of those in the IWW who had opposed legal defense activities. Political prisoners. When World War I ended, agitation for the release of all political prisoners began. The demands for amnesty included not only members of the IWW, but socialists and other dissidents, as well as conscientious object. Haywood did not abandon work on behalf of U.S. workers during his years in the Soviet Union. In 1925 he suggested the formation of a comprehensive defense organization for political prisoners in the United States. Out of this suggestion emerged the International Labor Defense Daily Worker, June 2, 16, 29, 30, and July 6, 13, 14, 18, 1925, Sasha. Small, 10 Years of Labor Defense, New York, 1935, pp. 6-9. The IWW in the post-war years. 229 tours to military service who had been imprisoned during the war. Amnesty committees were organized in a number of cities, and the General Defense Committee of the IWW and the National Executive Committee of the Socialist Party launched campaigns for the release of all political prisoners. In addition, the Workers' Defense Union, headed by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, played a leading role in the defense of men and women caught in the federal and state red raids. In a letter of March 25, 1919, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wrote, "There are nearly 2,000 political prisoners in the United States today. Many of them are well known and well beloved, others are obscure and almost forgotten. We must speak and act at once and in a determined manner for all those who pay with their freedom for their devotion to their class." She declared that some 250 organizations were affiliated with the Workers' Defense Union, representing approximately 800,000 workers and radicals in the New York District. 1. When President Wilson visited Seattle during his campaign for the League of Nations in September 1919, thousands, wearing hatbands with streamers, released political prisoners lined the streets through which the president passed. Among them were members of the IWW. But many Wobblies felt that the defense activities weakened the organization precisely when it needed strengthening. Defense submerged organization, wrote Art Shields, in explaining this attitude, through the rank and file of the IWW as a sullen, half-suppressed resentment against any defense program that interferes with organization work. The new society is not built through propaganda in the courts but out in the works where the blueprints are. 3. Wobblies opposed to the defense activities argued that the only legitimate work for the IWW was economic. By engaging in political activities, such as electoral politics or litigation in the capitalist courts, the IWW was wasting its time and resources, diverting them from the primary task of industrial organizing, and playing into the hands of the bosses, who controlled the state apparatus, including the courts. 94. As one opponent of legal defense activities put it, the capitalists like to have the IWW exhaust its financial resources and waste its energies on legal defense without any results great enough so you might notice them. They like all this because they know that if only they can induce the IWW to adhere to this policy long enough, then the organization, through exhaustion in all directions, will lose its effectiveness as an instrument in the hands of the workers to gain better conditions and to put the capitalists to work. 95. Supporters of the legal defense activities of the IWW, however, argued that it had been because of the Wobblies' ability to defend all the victims of 230. Post-war struggles, 1918 to 1920, the class war, that we have inspired the workers with confidence and have given them the courage necessary to carry on the fight. It might be fine reading for students of history 200 years after the revolution, another defender of legal defense activities declared, to come across the pages telling of how the IWW let thousands go to the gallows and prisons by spurning legal defense in capitalist courts, but many have been saved by legal defense in those courts, and as long as there is a possibility of saving more we will keep on with legal defense. One would hate to stay in prison, he continued, until the spirit shown by the opponents of legal defense developed enough power to tear down the walls and tie knots in the steel bars. Hell will be frozen over pretty well by that time, to say the least. To the purists within the ranks of the IWW, the only legitimate activity for the organization was economic activity, while political activity was regarded not only as useless but as a betrayal of the purposes of the Union. For those holding these views, the capitalist industrial and political system could be overthrown only through organizing workers into industrial unions and preparing them to operate the industrial society after the capitalist industrial and political system had crumbled under the impact of the general strike. Indeed, a sizable segment of the membership had a somewhat mystical faith in the efficacy of an IWW-led general strike to force an amnesty for all Wobbly prisoners. "Isn't it clear by this time," asked one Wobbly, "that we spend time, energy and money upon lawyers and court procedure? We are diverting same away from agitating, organizing and taking action in industry." 96. Internal dissension developed further over the manner in which IWW political prisoners gained their freedom. To demonstrate solidarity and loyalty to the class struggle, several Wobblies in Leavenworth Federal Prison decided not to apply for individual clemency but to demand a general amnesty. Those who, like Ralph Chaplin, accepted individual clemency were regarded as traitors to the working class. Most Wobblies in prison pledged not to accept individual paroles, but to demand that we all be released together, or we will do our complete terms. Later, however, as the IWW became increasingly weaker, Wobblies left prison however they could, with paroles or with pardons. 97. As a Christmas gesture, President Harding commuted the sentence of Eugene V. Debs, the grand old man of American socialism, late in 1921. At the same time, the administration offered pardons to a number of alien Wobblies in Leavenworth on the condition that they accept immediate deportation. 12 accepted. 98. The IWW in the post-war years. 231. The IWW and the International Communist Movement. IWW's attitude toward political action emerged in bold relief over the question of its relations with the Soviet Union. On January 24, 1919, a call went out from Moscow to all revolutionary workers' movements and proletarian groups to send representatives to the First Congress of the Third International Comintern. The IWW was included because, as the invitation noted, in the epoch of the disintegration and collapse of the entire capitalist world system, the task of the proletariat now is to seize state power immediately, and to that end, according to the invitation, it is necessary to form a bloc with those elements in the revolutionary workers' movement who, although they did not formally belong to socialist parties, now stand by and large for the proletarian dictatorship in the form of Soviet power. Chief among those are the syndicalist elements in the workers' movement. 99. On August 14, 1919, IWW's General Executive Board voted unanimously to provide for the representation of the IWW as a constituent member of the Third International. The resolution read, whereas, the Soviet Republic of Russia, in the call for the organization of the Third International, included the IWW as one of the bodies eligible to such new international, and whereas, the IWW is the only revolutionary organization in the United States whose program is absolutely scientific and uncompromising, and is the logical American unit of the Third International, and whereas, the proletarian revolution is worldwide and not national or local in its scope. Therefore, the time has come for the IWW to assume its proper place as the American unit of the Workers' Red International, and to establish closer relations with groups of the same or similar principles in every country, such as the Communists of Russia, Hungary, Bavaria, etc., the Spartacus of Germany, the Syndicalists of France, Italy and Great Britain and other countries, and the Industrial Unionists of Canada and Australia. Resolved that the IWW shall create a Committee on International Relations, which shall at once establish and maintain correspondence and fraternal relations with each aforesaid revolutionary group throughout the world and shall provide for the representation of the IWW as a constituent member of the Third International. 100 other groups in the United States invited were the left elements in the American Socialist Party, in particular, the group representing Debs and the League for Socialist Propaganda, the Workers' International Industrial Union, a Socialist Labor Party adjunct, and the Socialist Workers' Party of America. Invitation to the First Congress of the Communist International, in the Communist International, 19/1943. Documents, selected and edited by Jane Degras, London 1956, L. 1919-1922, 1-5. 232. Postwar Struggles, 1918-1920. No one, however, went to the Congress of the Third International from the IWW, but this was not because of any ideological differences. Rather, it was because of the difficulties facing the organization at home and the problems of travel. 101. In January 1920, Zinoviev, the president of the Executive Committee of the Third International, sent a long letter to the IWW in which he extended the hand of brotherhood and urged it to take the initiative in trying to establish a basis for the uniting in one organization of all unions which have a class-conscious, revolutionary character, of all workers who accept the class struggle, such as the WIIU, Workers' International Industrial Union of the Socialist Labor Party, the One Big Union of Canada, and certain insurgent unions in the AFL. The letter took note of the IW's opposition to the state in general, and declared, "We, communists, also want to abolish the state." However, it insisted that, temporarily, a state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, was necessary in order to destroy the capitalist state, break up capitalist resistance and confiscate capitalist property in order to turn it over to the whole working class in common. Once this was accomplished, and all class divisions were done away with, the letter continued, the proletarian dictatorship, the state automati. Cali disappears, to make way for an industrial administrative body which will be something like the General Executive Board of the IWW. Zinnovieve's letter also referred to the IW's aversion to politics and political action, but went on to argue that the Wobblies used the word politics in too narrow a sense. Quoting Marx, the letter noted his state meant that every class struggle is a political struggle. GLE. That is to say, every struggle of the workers against the capitalists is a struggle of the workers for the political power, the state power. The letter called for two organizations, the union and the party, the former with an industrial task, the latter with an overall administrative task. The special and particular business of the FWW is to train the workers for the seizure and management of industry. The special function of the Communist Political Party is to train the workers for the capture of political power and the administration of the proletarian dictatorship. All workers should at the same time be members of the revolutionary industrial movement of their industry and of the political party which advocates communism. The IWW in the post-war years 233. Published in full in Solidarity on August 14, 1920, the letter was accompanied by an editorial urging all members and readers to study it, and we invite and urge the fullest discussion and comment upon it in these columns from all members of the IWW and from readers. But on August 28, even before the debate on affiliation with the Third International began, Solidarity headlined the news that a special referendum had been called by the JEB on whether to affiliate with the Third International. The referendum called for a vote on three propositions: 1. Endorsing the Third International, without reservation; 2. Not endorsing the Third International, officially, and to notify it that the IWW was in favor of an economic industrial international; 3. Endorsing the Third International, with reservations as follows: that we take no part in parliamentary action whatever, and reserve the right to develop our own tactics according to conditions prevailing in America. Significantly, the JEB itself had voted on each of the three propositions before sending them out, and by a majority of 5-2 opposed endorsing the Third International, without reservation. The other two propositions were adopted by majorities. Moreover, the board took two other actions to assure that affiliation with the Third International would be defeated. On the same day that it authorized the referendum, it also specifically banned further distribution of the pro-Bolshevik pamphlet published in 1918, The Red Dawn, The Bolsheviki and the WW, by Harrison. George, a prominent Wobbly. Haywood wrote later that this action reflected the opposition which had developed in the IWW against the state character of the Soviets. 103 Then the JEB issued an advisory bulletin that seemed to advise all members to vote against affiliation with the Third International. For example, it urged that the referendum on the Third International should be thoroughly discussed and cautioned. 0 Beware, as an attempt will be made to stampede the IWW into parliamentary channels. 104. This position was quickly endorsed by the Industrial Worker, which came out unequivocally against affiliation in an editorial entitled, We Oppose Political Affiliation. It declared, we refuse to permit the IWW to become the tail of the kite of a political organization, so far as we can use our effort to prevent it. 105 2 weeks later, in the same issue that carried the text of the affiliation referendum, the Industrial Worker carried a two-line editorial that stated bluntly, why not affiliation with the Salvation Army? That, too, is an international body. 106. 234. Post-war struggles, 1918 to 1920. The Third International had been defeated. The reported vote was: first proposition, second proposition, third proposition, yes. Number 602 1, 658 913 1, 113 994 11 11 107. Thus, in a very small vote, the IWW refused to have anything to do with the Third International. Another opportunity for the IWW to join with the international communist movement arose in 1921. The 1921 IWW convention upheld a decision of the General Executive Board to reject cooperation with American communist groups, but the convention, over the strenuous objections of the most anti-communist Wobblies, agreed to send George Williams as IWW delegate to the convention of the Red International of Labor Unions, RILU, to be held later that year in Moscow. Williams was instructed to stand firm on all issues dividing syndicalists from Bolsheviks. 108. Prior to the Moscow Congress, Williams met in Berlin with syndicalists from various countries and helped draw up a syndicalist manifesto, which called for an independent economic international. The term independent was intended to mean politically independent of the policies of the Communist International. 109. At the RILU Congress, which opened in Moscow on July 1, 1921, the syndicalists were in a minority and were voted down on these issues. Over the objections of Williams and other syndicalists, a resolution on questions of tactics was approved by the Congress, which included: the IWW, an independent organization in America, is too weak to take the place of the old labor unions. The IWW have a purely anarchistic prejudice against politics and political action, being divided into supporters and opponents of such a cardinal question as proletarian dictatorship. Therefore, the question of creating revolutionary cells and groups inside the American Federation of Labor is of vital importance. There is no other way by which one could gain the working mass in America than to lead a systematic struggle within the unions. 110. In the fall of 1920, the United Communist Party, Communist and Labor, suggested to the IWW that representatives of the executive boards of each should meet privately and decide on terms of cooperation. The terms proposed by the Communists included the Statement 0 that the IWW cease misleading the workers with the teaching that the revolution can be achieved by industrial organization in the shops and factories and the direct seizure of industry, without first overwhelming the capitalist state and establishing the proletarian dictatorship of the Soviets. The IWW General Executive Board rejected the proposals and cooperation with the Communists. Solidarity, October 30, 1920. Industrial H6RKER, November 13, 1920. The organization was also known as the Red Trade Union International, RTUI, the Red International of Trade Unions, RITU, and the Profitern. The IWW in the post-war years 235. As might be expected, Williams reported to the IWW's General Executive Board that his experiences at the Congress were a great disappointment to me, and a great lesson. He charged that the Congress was dominated by the Communist Party, and that the political faction, the Communists, did not want an economic international in fact but in name only. That a real international of revolutionary industrial unions would become such a powerful organization and of such worldwide influence in the revolutionary field that the political organizations would have to surrender their present dominant position. Consequently, the tacticians in the Communist International are making every effort to control such an organization and keep it in the embryo stage. Williams concluded, I am convinced that a truly economic international of revolutionary industrial unions cannot exist with headquarters in Moscow without being dominated by the Communist International. It is a physical impossibility. 111. Several other IWWers were in Moscow at the time, and 8 of them, including Haywood, cabled the IWW's General Executive Board that Williams' report was fabricated and prejudiced. This protest was dismissed because the signers were all communists, but William Z. Foster, who was a correspondent for the Federated Press at the Congress, described Williams's report as highly biased. He noted that the Congress had elected a broad executive council, made up of 4 delegates from Soviet Russia, 2 each for all organizations from the large countries, and 1 each for the small movements. 112. Calling, affiliation. With this so-called international not only undesirable, but absolutely impossible, the IWW's General Executive Board voted against affiliation with the Red International of Labor Unions. 6 reasons were listed, but the most important was the 6th, which read, even if it were permitted, by the IWW Constitution, to associate our activities with any political group, the IWW would find it impossible to cooperate with the Communist Party of America. 113. In short, it all boiled down to anti-communism. In his study, The Decline of the WW, John S. Gams points out that anti-communism was a vital factor in the decline of the industrial workers of the world. 114. Although the IWW had declined drastically in the early 1920s, we shall see in our succeeding volumes that it still was able to conduct militant struggles in San Pedro, California in 1923, in Colorado coal mines in 1927, in Boulder Canyon, Nevada in 1931, and in Yakima Valley, Washington in 1933. Moreover, while some of the wobbly leaders turned to the right, and some went into business to make money, most of them stayed on the left, and many, like Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. 236. Post-war struggles, 1918 to 1920. Charles Ashley, and others, found new areas of engagement in the communist movement and in union activities it inspired. Asterisk as Len de Cox points out, all the wobblies who continued on the left formed a living link with the old IWW and the radicalism that marked the rise of the CIO in the mid-30s. 115 Ralph Chaplin, who wrote the historic union song, Solidarity Forever, became a vigorous anti-communist and degenerated into a publicity agent for Dave Beck, the despotic, reactionary leader of the Teamsters Union. Similarly, Morris Sigmund, ex-organizer for the IWW, became president of the ILGWU in 1923 and speedily demonstrated how to function as a despotic union leader, allying himself with employers, the police, and even with gangsters, to regain control of the union. Stanley Nadel, Reds vs. Pinks. A Civil War in the International Ladies' Garment Union. New York History 66, January 1985, 56, 71. Chapter 1-3. The Split in the Socialist Party and the Formation of the Communist Party. Nature and Ideology of the Left Wing. The initial effect of American intervention in World War I was to strengthen the Socialist Party. Although some of its most prominent leaders, John Spargo, William English Walling, Upton Sinclair and Algernon Simons, broke with the party and supported the war effort, the party membership remained firm in opposition to the war, and the votes for socialist candidates actually increased. The party won 34% of the vote in Chicago's 1917 municipal election, 35% in Toledo, and only slightly smaller percentages in other industrial cities. In the New York City mayoralty race, Morris Hillquit received 150,000 votes, 22% of the total. While nationally, the socialists elected few candidates to office, 10 socialists were elected to the New York State Legislature. 1. Although the government persecution of the Socialist Party under the Espionage and Sedition Acts did weaken the party in certain parts of the country, the number of dues-paying members rose from 70,853 in July. Traditional scholarship holds that the strength of the Socialist Party peaked in 1912 and then entered an irreversible decline. These scholars, including David A. Shannon and Daniel Bell, maintain that the socialist anti-war position provoked governmental repression which destroyed or severely weakened the party. James Weinstein disputes this view, maintaining that the party did not decline after 1912 and actually grew in strength during the war. The decline of the party, he argues, did not take place until the post-war period when factionalism split it apart. Weinstein, however, fails to see the influence of the conservative ideology of socialist leaders like Victor Berger and Morris Hillquit in the decline of the party. See David A. Shannon, The Socialist Party of America, A History, New York, 1935, Ira. Kipnis, The American Socialist Movement, 1897–1912, New York, 1952, James Weinstein. The Decline of Socialism in America, 1912–1925, New York, 1967. 238. Postwar Struggles, 1918–1920, 1917–101,571 in March 1918. By August 1918, it had declined to 83,000, but a year later, in July 1919, it was up again, this time to 104,000.2. Most of the Socialist Party's increased membership came from the new immigrants. At a joint meeting of the state secretaries from New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Connecticut, and Wisconsin, large increases in membership were reported for most of the foreign language federations of the party. The Finnish, Lettish, Italian and Lithuanian federations all showed increases, while the Russian language federation reported that by August 1918, it had 5 times the membership it had had in April 1917.3. By the middle of 1919, the foreign language federations, which had constituted only 12% of the Socialist Party in 1912, contained about 53% of the total membership. Meanwhile, the old English-speaking locals were either declining in membership or standing still. Clearly, the nature and composition of the Socialist Party had undergone a process of change during the war. 5. There had always been a left wing in the Socialist Party, but the growth of the language federations and the inspiration of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia combined to enhance greatly the power and zeal of the left. The foreign language federations served as the network for discussions of a left outlook within the party. They also provided the financial support and political encouragement for English-speaking left-wingers who became the spokespersons for this trend. With the triumph of the Bolshevik Revolution, the prestige, zeal and membership of the left wing mushroomed. It organized its own caucuses, membership rolls, financial systems, propaganda organs and theoretical magazines. Throughout the summer of 1918, left-wing socialists were consolidating their strength in Boston, New York, Cleveland and Chicago. These men and women were determined to revitalize the Socialist Party. While they were spurred on by the Bolshevik Revolution, it was the situation in the Socialist Party itself which intensified their demand for changes. In Boston on November 16, 1918, the Socialist Propaganda League began publication of a new left-wing bi-weekly newspaper, the Revolutionary Age. Later, the journal was moved to New York and placed under the editorship of Louis C. Freyna. It was in the Revolutionary Age that Lenin's letter to American workers first appeared. 7. The Class Struggle was also established in New York, edited by Freyna, Louis Boudin and Ludwig Lohr. In its initial statement, the left-wing journal emphasized that for the first time in America a Marxism worthy of the name was possible. The split in the Socialist Party. 239. The general mental unpreparedness which wrecked the Second International was particularly marked in this country. An opportunist leadership with limited mental outlook has kept the large masses of socialists in this country in utter ignorance of the deeper currents of thought in the international socialist movement. At the same time, it discouraged all independent thinking, thereby destroying whatever chance there was of the movement in this country mud-dling through independently to some of the modes of thought indispensable to the modern socialist movement, and preventing any serious and independent consideration of American problems. As a result, there is practically no independent socialist thought in this country, and the socialist ideas elaborated abroad usually reach us only as soulless and meaningless formulae and often as mere reflexes of old-world radical and nationalistic sympathies, animosities and struggles. 8. In an article published in Class Struggle in February 1918, the left wing declared, "As a preliminary, let us integrate the revolutionary elements in the party. An organization for the revolutionary conquest of the party by the party. The American Socialist Party needs a definite organized, vocal left wing, a unified expression of revolutionary socialism in theory and practice." 9. The left-wing groups regarded themselves as the descendants of the left wing that had been in evidence in the Socialist Party since its formation in 1901, but they believed that the war had raised issues that demanded new socialist tactics. 10. The collapse of the Second International, the failure of many socialist leaders to live up to the St. Louis Manifesto, and the Bolshevik Revolution all combined to necessitate a new formulation of the left wing's position. Previously, the main emphasis of the left wing had been on industrial unionism and the general strike as a means by which the workers could seize the major industries of the United States. However, in line with Leninist doctrine, the new left wing believed that the aim of the workers should be to seize the machinery of government itself. 11. The source of revolutionary practice, said the revolutionary age, is not the theory of yesterday, but the experience of the revolution in Russia. 12. The aim of the new left-wing group was to convert the Socialist Party to a new revolutionary philosophy and to use the existing party machinery to achieve this goal. This would be accomplished at an emergency national convention where the left, working as a tightly knit organization, would eliminate all the reform planks from the Socialist Party's official program and replace them with a true revolutionary policy. 13. We must clear the party of the bureaucrats, the reactionaries and the traitors by 240. Post-war struggles. 1918 to 1920, simply voting them out of their jobs and offices. It is our duty in this day of the world to make the party real red, instead of pink, as it is accused of being. 14. In August 1918, reformists and left-wingers had combined forces at a joint meeting and placed the Socialist Party firmly on record as being in accord with Soviet Russia. The manifesto emerging from the meeting read, "The Socialist Party of America declares itself in accord with revolutionary Russia and urges our government and our people to cooperate with it and to assist it to the end that democratic forces of the world may be victorious and autocracy and imperialism banished forever." 15. In January 1919, the Socialist Party's National Executive Committee referred to the Bolshevik Revolution as by far the greatest achievement in the establishment of working-class government in the history of the world, and added that it should receive the encouragement and support of the workers in all countries. Asterisk above all, Allied troops should be withdrawn from Russia, in the name of democracy, in the interest of world peace, in the interest of the Russian workers, and in the name of international decency and fair play. 16. To all this was added the issue as to which of the international socialist groups it would adhere. Should the party follow Victor Berger's advice and cooperate with the patriotic socialists of the Second International who had met in Bern, Switzerland in February 1919, or should it throw in its lot with the revolutionary socialists who had met in Moscow early in March at the founding convention of the Third International, generally known as the Communist International or the Comintern? 17. The call for the first convention of the Third International had been sent in January 1919 to 39 different workers' groups. 4 American groups had been invited: the Socialist Labor Party, the left-wing elements of the Socialist Party, the IWW and the Workers' International Industrial Union. No delegates actually arrived at the March convention from the United States. Boris Reinstein, who represented the Socialist Labor Party, had been living in Russia for a number of years. Another representative was S. J. Rutgers, living in Holland. 18. The platform of the Oakland, California, Socialist Party, adopted in January 1919, contained the following tribute to the Bolshevik Revolution. The specter of socialism that has been haunting the world of capitalism since the beginning of the 19th century has now burst the bounds of mere theory and has become a living, constructive reality. Out of the East, in darkest Russia, the light has broken through the autocratic clouds of oppression and wrong and taken full possession of industry and politics. Oakland World, January 31, 1919. The split in the Socialist Party. 241. In its manifesto issued on February 8, 1919, the left-wing section of the Socialist Party had unconditionally supported the Third International and had urged the Socialist Party to join it. The manifesto was circulated among socialist branches throughout the country. It called, among other things, for the abolition of all social reform planks in the party platform and declared that the party must teach, propagate and agitate exclusively for the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism through the dictatorship of the proletariat. The left-wing program of the New York Socialists became the rallying point for left-wingers in the Socialist Party, and local after local endorsed the manifesto during 1919. 19. Victory of the left wing. We of the left wing declare that we repudiate moderate socialism, and all its bourgeois affiliations, wrote John Reed in April, 1919, whose activities, however sincerely meant, are nevertheless directed toward patching up the capitalist system and avoiding the socialist revolution. By the time this appeared, the left wing was in control of local Boston, and the locals of Seattle, Cleveland, Rochester, and Philadelphia were either completely left-oriented or turning to the left. In New York, the locals in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens had already affiliated with the left-wing section. 20. The national referendum elections of the Socialist Party for positions on the National Executive Committee, held by mail in March 1919, gave big majorities to all left-wing candidates. The left wing won 12 of 15 seats, and in the contest for international secretary, left-wing candidate Kate Richards O'Hare received 13,262 votes to 4,775 for SB stalwart Morris Hillquit, while left-winger John Reed got 17,235 votes for the SECO-ND international post to 4,871 for socialist ex-congressman Victor Berger. Charles E. Ruthenberg and Alfred Wagenknecht, leaders of the left wing, also won posts on the new national executive by large majority ties, 21. In short, the election of a new National Executive Committee found left-wingers in control of 12 of the 15 seats, thus demonstrating, as one student points out, a popular movement within the party nationally toward the left. 22. The Purge. When the old guard that was in control of the Socialist Party refused to make the figures of the election public, it became known as the suppressed referendum. A left-winger, L. E. Catterfield, who was in the 242 Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920 National Office, was finally able to disclose the tally. The results of the election revealed clearly that the left wing was far in the majority nation ally and should normally have been in control of the Socialist Party. 23. However, the old guard was unwilling to abide by the election results. As early as January 1919, the New York Call carried letters suggesting that the leftists be purged. By May, this sentiment had mounted considerably among the party's right-wingers. In articles in the Call and in the pamphlet, The Immediate Issue, Hillquit argued that it would be futile to preach reconciliation and union. He suggested that the left wing separate. Better 100 times to have two numerically small socialist organizations, each homogeneous and harmonious within itself, than to have one big party tom by dissensions and squabbles, an impotent colossus on feet of clay. The time for action is near. Let us clear the decks. 24. It was a clear warning to the left wing that if they would not leave voluntarily, they would be expelled from the party. The fact that they had elected a majority of the National Executive Committee and represented the vast majority of the party members did not matter. 25. When the National Executive Committee met in Chicago on May 28, the old guard leadership who still controlled the NEC decided to act. When it assembled, the old NEC was faced with the situation that had developed in New York. The New York State Committee had revoked the charter of 7 of the state's language federations. The Russian, Lettish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Polish, and South Slavic organizations were suspended because of their affiliation with the N.Y. Left WMG Section. The expelled language federations of the state of New York now asked the NEC for full reinstatement and demanded further that the NEC discipline the New York State Organization. 26. It was practically certain that the NEC would side with the New York State Committee on this issue. By a vote of 8-2, the NEC went even further. It suspended the 7 national federations whose branches had been involved in the dispute with the New York State Committee. Those members of the federations who were not in agreement with left-wing organizations would be welcomed back into the regular branches and locals of the Socialist Party. 27. The NEC also revoked the charter of the Michigan State Organization when it amended its constitution to include the following: any member, local or branch of a local, advocating legislative reforms or supporting organizations formed for the purpose of advocating such reforms, shall be expelled from the Socialist Party. Although this unqualified rejection of social and parliamentary reforms was both anti-Marxist and anti-Leninist. The split in the Socialist Party. 243. The abrupt expulsion of the whole state organization with its 6,000 members was shocking. 28. The NEC then voided the elections for the new National Executive Committee, in which the left wing had triumphed overwhelmingly. The excuse was that there had been irregularities. A new committee would be elected at the Special Emergency Convention scheduled to meet in Chicago on August 30, 1919.29. By these actions, the NEC had expelled 30,000 members, the great bulk of whom were members of foreign language federations. It had declared open warfare against the left wing and made it clear that it was not prepared to tolerate serious opposition, even if this policy risked the virtual dissolution of the party. 30. Meanwhile, in an attempt to ensure that the party's convention would be dominated by those who accepted the leadership's ideology, it continued to purge the socialist PCUT of left-wing elements. When Massachusetts Social ISDS, at a convention held early in June, vented their anger at the NEC's voiding of the elections by deciding to send 2 representatives to the National Conference of the Left Wing scheduled to be held in New York, the NEC voted by telegram to revoke the state party's charter and to reorganize it. 31 In New York, the state secretary, Walter M. Cook, said about revoking the charters of left-wing locals. "I have no doubt," he wrote on June 2, "but what the state of New York will be rid of this gang. Before the 1st of August, and beginning with that month I expect to make a very vigorous drive for increased activity in the party." 32 In their determination to keep control of the party, the old guard leaders refused to send out for voting purposes a referendum that had been initiated by local Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, Ohio, which called for the immediate reversal of the NEC's decision to expel the language Federations and the Michigan Socialist PCUT. 33. The Left-Wing Conference. As the trend of events became clear, locals Boston and Cleveland in the left-wing section of New York issued a call for a national conference of the left wing to be held on June 21. 94 delegates from 20 states attended the conference. Most of them were from the 4 states of Michigan, Massachusetts, Ohio and New York, and from the expelled land gauge federations. Among those present were John Reed, editor of the New LBRK Communist, and other leaders of the Greater New York locals of the Socialist Party, Louis C. Frena, writer and publicist, Charles E. Ruthenberg, Cleveland organizer and editor of the Socialist News, Alfred Wagenknecht, Socialist Party State Secretary of Ohio, Rose Pastor Stokes. 244. Post-War Struggles, 1918 to 1920. Irish-born James Larkin, the youthful William Whinstone and Oakley Johnson, the latter being part of the delegation of the expelled Michigan Socialists. Besides these English-speaking socialists, there were the heads of the foreign language federations, such as Alexander Stoklitsky, head of the powerful Russian Federation, J. G. Stilson of the J. Lithuanian Federation, D. Elbaum of the Polish Federation and Carl, James of the Latvian Federation. 35. The conference became the scene of a heated debate over the situation in the Socialist Party and how to cope with it. About 1/3 of the delegates were of the opinion that it was useless to continue trying to capture the Socialist Party machinery. Led principally by the Michigan and Foreign Language Federation groups, these delegates insisted on withdrawing from the Socialist Party and calling a convention in Chicago on September 1 to form a new party, the Communist Party of America. The majority of the left wing, led by Reed and Ruthenberg, were either American or spoke English. They argued in favor of continuing the struggle against opportunism in the party and of leaving the question of the party's future until the emergency convention scheduled for August 30 in Chicago. They expressed the view that only if the left wing failed to win over a majority at the convention should the majority group of the left wing organize a separate communist party. 36. Speaking on the resolution that the left wing sever all relations with the Socialist Party, and that we begin immediately the organization of the Communist Party, Ruthenberg declared, "I believe personally that the proposition contained in that resolution would be the best way in the world to hamper the left-wing movement in the organization of a virile communist party in the future. We have won the fight within the Socialist Party, and now some comrades come here and ask me to scuttle the ship and run away when we have won a victory. We only need to press that victory in order to take hold of the existing order." Applause. "We carried on a fight through the machinery of the party organization. We have won in a referendum. If we now step out of the organization and remember there is in the heart of most members some feeling of loyalty to the organization, the Socialist Party, which they have sacrificed for so many years, is something they don't want to easily let go of, and if we take this step and ask them to go, the New York Communist began publishing on April 19, 1919, at which time the Revolution on Airy Age had been publishing for several months as the official organ of local Boston. John Reed and others had tried to have the Revolutionary Age transferred to New York, but at this time Frena, the editor, refused. The New York Communist was published only until the National Conference of the Left Wing established headquarters in New York City with the Revolutionary Age as its official organ. The split in the Socialist Party. 245 Outside the organization, we are not going to carry with us as many members of that party, those who even are in sympathy with our purpose and our manifesto and our program, than if we continue to fight through the 2 short months that still lie before the National Convention. Although the minority criticized Ruthenberg, Reed and others who still believed that the Socialist Party could be captured or, for that matter, was worth capturing, the majority hoped that by staying in the party they could win the support of wavering elements in various sympathetic locals. But the minority, made up of 31 delegates or 1/3 of the conference, viewed this as opportunism, and decided to have nothing further to do with the convention. 37. The conference continued for 4 days, approving the left-wing manifesto which accused Hillquit and company of basing the party program upon the petty bourgeoisie and the skilled aristocracy of labor. of failing to support industrial unionism and the workers' economic struggles, of supporting the discredited Second International, and of generally carrying on a policy of reform which led, not to socialism, but to the perpetuation of capitalism. The left-wing manifesto called for full support of industrial unionism, support of the Russian Revolution, affiliation to the Communist International, and a program aimed at the abolition of the capitalist system and its replacement by socialism. The conference elected a governing council of 9 and combined the communist with the revolutionary age. It also discussed the strategy to be adopted in order to gain control of the Chicago Convention. 38. The purge continues. While the minority delegates insisted on withdrawing from the Socialist Party and went ahead with plans for a national convention to form a communist party, Reed, Ruthenberg, Wagenknecht and Isaac E. Ferguson, representing the majority, met in Cleveland on July 26 and declared that they had received a majority of the votes cast for the NEC and were therefore the rightful executive committee. The group demanded that Adolf Germer, the party's national secretary, hand over the national office to them. 39. Germer and the Old Guard not only refused, but they kept a close watch on the national office in Chicago, fearing that the left wing might attempt to seize control of the party machinery, or at least of its records. Germer informed Hillquit that he had been staying in the national office at night, expecting the leftists to try some rough stuff. 40. 246. Postwar Struggles. 1918 to 1920. Meanwhile, the purge of the party ranks continued. In August, the Ohio Socialist Party was expelled for left-wing affiliation, and several minor party organizations were also expelled. It is estimated that by the end of July, 1919, the number of expelled members had grown to almost 70,000, or two-thirds of the party membership. 41. Enraged by the expulsion policy and the undemocratic procedures followed by the NEC, the Finnish American Socialists, whose numerical strength in the party was at that point greater than ever, demanded that the Old Guard leadership step down. 25 Finnish socialist branches sent protests to national headquarters, demanding section reinstatement of the expelled federations and state party organizations. 4. Not only did the Finnish American Socialists fail in their attempt, but the party's press began a barrage against the left wing and predicted a split at the forthcoming convention. The Call declared that the left wing deserved to be expelled, labeling the idea of importing Russian revolutionary methods to America as utopian, and comparing it with the attempts of supporters of Robert Owen and Charles Fourier to establish socialist colonies in the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. Lessons can be learned from other countries, to be sure, argued the Call, but policies cannot be copied everywhere. It was better, it went on, that the party be rid of those ridiculous enough to suppose that Bolshevism would succeed in the United States. 43. The Chicago Socialist Party Convention. Despite all this, right up to the opening of the Socialist Party's National Emergency Convention in Chicago on August 30, the majority group of the left wing continued to believe that they could capture the party machinery. It soon became evident that this was wishful thinking. From the very beginning of the convention, the Old Guard had control of affairs, insisting that the credentials of all delegates be cleared at the Socialist Party's national office before they would be allowed to be seated. On August 29, the evening preceding the National Convention, left-wing delegates met and unanimously agreed that the left wing should initially meet with the Socialist Party rather than bolt immediately to form a new organization. The caucus agreed that left-wingers would withdraw from the convention unless several conditions were met, including seating the new National Executive Committee, withdrawal of expulsions and suspend scions, seating of contested delegations, and adherence to the Third LNTER National. 44. When the convention opened on Sunday, September 31 at Machinists' the split in the Socialist Party. 247. Hall in Chicago. Adolf Germer ordered nearly all left-wingers present to leave the hall. When the delegates protested that they held credentials, Germer demanded that they produce white admission cards, which none had. Germer then declared, "I shall ask you in a comradely way to leave the hall." John Reed challenged Germer, at which point Germer issued the fateful order which broke the Socialist Party. "All right, officers, clear the hall," Germer shouted. Many of the delegates held onto their seats as several uniformed and plainclothes officers of the Chicago police, already on the premises, forcibly ejected the left wing from the Socialist Party. Delegates were swept toward the doors and, one by one, broken loose from their chairs and moved out of the convention hall. 45. To the left wing, the arrival of the police was evidence that the Old Guard was more ready to ally itself with bourgeois law enforcement agents than with revolutionaries. Indeed, as soon as the convention resumed, a bitter dispute arose over this issue, and even some moderate socialists criticized the Old Guard for having called in the police. 46. Above the tumult, Ludwig E. Catterfield, left-wing leader from Kansas, was heard to say to Germer, "This will make 10,000 members for us." Anita Whitney of California announced that Germer's police tactics had converted her to a new party of the left. 47. Having excluded the left-wingers, the emergency convention of the Socialist Party pieced together a number of resolutions, a majority and minority report on international relations and a manifesto all radical sounding. The resolutions included denunciation of the military occupation of Ireland and a demand for self-determination for the Irish Republic. Condemnation of pogroms against the Jews, along with noting the absence of such programs in either Communist Soviet Russia or Communist Hungary. A call for a one-day strike on October 8, 1919 to free Tom Mooney. A warning against the intensification of U.S. imperialism and a protest against intervention in Mexico, and an endorsement of industrial unionism and the establishment of a labor department in the party for the preparation of literature and more active work among the labor unions. The majority report on international relations repudiated the Second International, the Bern Conference and all socialist parties that formed coalition governments with bourgeois parties. It called for the reconstruction of a socialist international that included the communist parties of Germany and Russia and all other parties which accepted the principle of the class struggle. Even this did not seem radical enough, and a minority report was later adopted by referendum calling for immediate affiliation. 248. Post-war struggles, 1918–1920 with the Third International. By a vote of 3,475 to 1,444, the referendum called UN the Socialist Party to apply for membership in the Third International. 48. Noting that the SP manifesto endorsed Russian Bolshevism and declared solidarity with the workers of Russia in establishing their Soviet Republic, the New York Sun asked, "Why, then, did they expel the left WMG of their party?" 49. The answer was that with the expulsion of the left-wingers, the old guard no longer had to worry about any pressure to fulfill the radical program outlined in the manifesto. The leadership made an attempt to exude confidence as it assured the membership that the party had survived, the terrorists within and the reaction without, and would emerge, stronger than ever after the cleansing. 50. Victor Berger openly rejoiced at the departure of a lot of anarchists from the ranks of the Socialist Party. 51. The fact was, however, that little remained of the old Socialist Party and that its membership after the 1919 split was hardly more than 20,000. 52. As even a critic of the left has admitted, the right wing had saved its hold on the party name and machinery, but had lost two-thirds of its membership. 53. The CLP and the CP. On the afternoon of the second day of the Socialist Convention, after standing in an anteroom as observers to the right-wing steamroller on the convention floor, over 80 leftists gave up any hope of entering the Socialist Convention on equitable terms and met downstairs. One by one additional delegates defected from the Socialist meeting upstairs and joined the radicals below. On September 3, these left-wing delegates moved to the IWW Hall and proceeded to write a constitution, platform, and program for the newly created Communist Labor Party of the United States of America. The Communist Labor Party declared itself in harmony with the principles of the Third International and, following the National Left-Wing Manifesto, pointed out that the major struggle was to be in the industrial arena. Elections were of propaganda value since it was not believed that gains could be made through existing political institutions. Industrial unionism, as practiced by the IWW, was the proper form of labor organization. The phrase, direct action, appeared frequently in the party's official document, and it was specifically noted that it was not associated with terrorism, violence, or by any other perverted meaning. But by it is meant such united action by the workers on the job which they made use in forcing. The split in the Socialist Party 249 concessions from the employing class directly, without the use of the capitalist state. 54. Meanwhile, the minority of the left wing, which had given up all hope of capturing the Socialist Party some weeks before, was meeting a few blocks away at the inaugural convention of the Communist Party of America. On the first day of the Communist Party convention, the Chicago anarchist squad burst into the hall and arrested a delegate. 55. The Communist Labor Party had 92 delegates at its convention. It issued no figures as to membership, but it was estimated that it represented about 10,000 members, most of whom were American-born. The Communist Party convention, on the other hand, was attended by 128 regular and fraternal delegates and claimed a membership of 58,000, mostly members of the foreign language federations. Alfred Wagenknecht was elected first secretary of the Communist Labor Party and Charles E. Ruthenberg first secretary of the Communist Party. 56. Attempts were made to bring the conventions of the Communist Labor Party and Communist Party together, but they were unsuccessful. The English-speaking communists did not wish to be lost in an organization dominated by European-oriented federations. The Communist Party was largely a federation of language units, while the Communist Labor Party made such language groups subordinate to the local organizations. The participants at the Communist Labor Party convention demanded that they must be accepted collectively into the Communist Party, but this proposal was rejected. The CP delegates insisted on individual acceptance, arguing that the Communist Labor Party contained a number of individuals who had joined its convention because of personal grievances against the old party officialdom or against the left-wing officialdom. 57. Although the two communist parties continued to work independently of each other, there were actually few ideological differences between them. Both denounced imperialism as the manifestation of monopoly capitalism, and both spoke of the need to abolish the capitalist system of industrial production and to create an industrial republic in which all industrial production would be socialized. Both parties resolved at their conventions to join the Communist International, and both determined to have nothing to do with immediate, partial political demands. The Communist Labor Party declared that its platform can contain only one demand: the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Communist Party asserted that its parliamentary representatives would neither introduce or support reform measures. 58. The program of the Communist Labor Party declared that its locals in 250 Postwar Struggles, 1918-1920 branches were to organize shop branches, to conduct communist propaganda and organization in the shops and factories, and to encourage the workers to organize in one big union. The party would also propagandize industrial unionism and industrial union organization, pointing out their revolutionary nature and possibilities. Indeed, it was to make the great industrial battles its major campaigns, to show the value of the strike as a political weapon. 59. The Communist Party likewise declared that it would make the great industrial struggles of the working class its major campaigns, in order to develop an understanding of the strikes in relation to the overthrow of capitalism. It would participate in mass strikes, not only to achieve the immediate purposes of the strike, but to develop the revolutionary implications of the mass strike. The Communist Party called for mass action, which was industrial in its origin, but acquired political character in the form of general political strikes and demonstrations, and for councils of workers to be organized in the shops as circumstances allow, for the purpose of carrying on the industrial union struggle within the old unions. The Communist Party must engage actively in the struggle to revolutionize the trade unions. As against the trade unionism of the American Federation of Labor, the Communist Party propagandizes industrial unionism and industrial union organization, emphasizing their revolutionary implications. 60. Both communist parties summoned the workers to organize on the job. Both, moreover, emphasized dual unionism. The Communist Labor Party called for the formation of one big union, as a rival to the AFL, and the Communist Party considered it to be a major task to agitate for the construction of a general industrial union organization embracing the RWW, WIIU, independent and secession unions, militant unions of the AFL and the unorganized workers on the basis of the revolutionary class struggle. 61. There is no evidence that any black delegates participated in the founding of either the Communist Labor Party or the Communist Party. In his brief mention of the founding of the Communist Party in 1919, David Montgomery comments on the labor program, but does not indicate the dual union outlook of both the Communist and Communist Labor Party at their founding. The fall of the House of Labor. The Workplace, the State, and American Labor Activism, 1865-1925, New York, 1987, p. 426. Participation of black socialists in the early communist movement will be discussed in our next volume. The split in the Socialist Party 251 platform of the Communist Labor Party was silent on the Negro question, but the Communist Party did include a paragraph on it which read, "In close connection with the unskilled worker is the problem of the Negro worker. The Negro problem is a political and economic problem. The racial expression of the Negro is simply the expression of his economic bondage and oppression, each intensifying the other. This complicates the Negro problem, but does not alter its proletarian character. The Communist Party will carry on agitation among the Negro workers to unite them with all class-conscious workers. 62. While this statement did acknowledge that the racial factor made some difference, it still viewed the Negro question as simply one aspect of the broader labor question. Moreover, the paragraph provoked no discussion. Indeed, in a detailed report published in The Liberator on the three conventions in Chicago Socialist, Communist Labor, and Communist Max, Eastman never once mentioned a discussion of the Negro question at any of the gatherings. Nor did Eastman once mention a discussion of the woman question at either the conventions of the two communist parties. The platforms of both the Communist and Communist Labor parties were silent on women's equality. 63. The truth is that throughout the spring, summer, and fall of 1919, as the split in the Socialist Party reached its climax, little attention was paid to the woman question in either the left or right-wing socialist or the then early communist circles. Actually, the editorial, "What's to Become of Women?" in the April 30, 1919 issue of the left-wing Ohio Socialist constituted the only discussion of this issue in the radical press during the period. It was prompted by a reader who asked the paper what would become of women under Bolshevism. The editorial responded with the reply that, "What is woman going to do with man under Bolshevism is a more pertinent question." According to the publication, under a social system where political and economic rights were equal, as they were under Bolshevism, man may well fear some reprisals and revenges upon him for the age-long persecution and humiliation of woman. Having equal rights with man, and since the war, being in all probability in the majority, what is to prevent them from getting even for the mountain of humiliation man has heaped upon them? It's a serious question. They will have the power. Will they use it? 64. 252. Post-war struggles, 1918 to 1920. Communist parties forced underground. Writing of the Red Scare which was in full swing when both the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party were formed, Robert K. Murray notes. Virtually every local communist in the nation was affected. Practical every leader of the movement, national or local, was put under arrest. Many members of the CLP and CP were the targets of brutal vigilante attacks. The California State Convention of the Communist Labor Party in November 1919 was followed by mob action against the local Oakland headquarters and the offices of the Oakland World, both of which were sacked by a group of war veterans who burned a large amount of literature, official records, and furniture. Although the Oakland police had been alerted in advance and urged to provide protection, not a single police officer was present during the time of the riot. 66 Bay Area leaders of the Communist Labor Party, including Anita Whitney, were arrested on charges of criminal syndicalism after the Communist Labor Party State Convention. 67. Federal agents indicted 85 members of the Communist Party in Chicago on charges of conspiracy to overthrow the government by force. 38 leaders of the Communist Labor Party were prosecuted for singing the red flag at the convention in Chicago and for declaring solidarity with the Soviet Union. As we have seen, on January 2, 1920, federal agents rounded up more than 4,000 suspected radicals, most of them believed to be communists, covering 33 major cities in 23 states. It is estimated that more than 50,000 members dropped out of both communist parties during this reign of terror. By 1920, the membership of the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party had dropped from an estimated 70,000 to 16,000.68. Their very existence threatened. The Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party were forced underground. Still, they did not cease their activities. The Voice of Labor, the CLP's official organ, and the Communist, the CP's official organ, continued to publish, as did papers issued by the language federations. More than 50 publications, 25 in New York City alone, continued to express the views of the two communist parties in the face of violence and threats of violence, as well as government prosecution. 69. A unified Communist Party. Previously, the opponents of unity in the communist movement had three: John Weiler, John Taylor, and Anita Whitney were convicted. The split in the Socialist Party 253 insisted that the CLP join the CP as individuals, or at best, as locals. They now raised a new obstacle, arguing that the predominantly American-born CLP leaders and members would lack sympathy for an understanding of the foreign-born workers who predominated in the Communist Party and would even seek to destroy the language federations once the two parties were united. 70. Eventually, however, a large section of the CP broke with the opponents of unity and, with Ruthenberg at their head, joined up with the Communist Labor Party. At the same time, groups separated from several of the land gauge federations, and the majority of the Jewish Federation disaffiliated from the CP and joined the Communist Labor Party. In May 1920, a unity convention was held in Bridgman, Michigan, at which the United Communist Party of America was formed. Ruthenberg was elected executive secretary, and the Central Executive Committee was made up of 5 members from the CP and 5 from the CLP. The United Communist Party included most of the members of the two former parties. The new party denied the desirability of reform within capitalist society, set as its goal the dictatorship of the proletariat, pledged allegiance to the Comintern and called on its members to work among black workers with the aim of uniting them with all class-conscious workers. It also opposed communists working within the AFL, thereby guaranteeing their isolation from the labor movement. 71. The creation of a single party turned out to be only an uneasy truce. In mid-July of 1920, a group broke away from the United Communist Party. A convention of the Communist Party and the Communist Party of America took place in May 1921 in Woodstock, New York. The convention established the new Communist Party of America. Ruthenberg became executive secretary of the CPA and a 10-member national executive committee was elected, with 5 representatives from each party. It was decided to locate the party headquarters in New York City. 72. An important step in developing a unified, effective Communist Party was taken with the establishment of the American Labor Alliance in July 1921. With the active support of the Communist Party, within a month the alliance began to charter locals for a new organization. At the same time, the Workers' Council, which had been formed in May 1921 by socialists who had been carrying on left-wing propaganda within the Socialist Party, also began work to create a new organization. Thus, the underground Communist Party, the American Labor Alliance and the Workers' Council all worked to unite militant forces into a new legal party, 73. An organizing convention met from December 23 to 26, 1921 in New 254. Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920. York City. Participating were 150 delegates from the American Labor Alliance, the Workers' Council and affiliated organizations. 3 fraternal delegates were also present from the Proletarian Party, which had been organized by the Michigan left-wingers. Over the opposition of only the Proletarian Party delegates, who demanded that their own organization be chosen, the convention announced the formation of a legal party, the Workers' Party of America, with an executive committee of 17 members, and with Ruthenberg as executive secretary. The Worker was chosen as the party's official organ. 74. The first article in the Constitution of the Workers' Party stated that its purpose was to educate and organize the working class for the abolition of capitalism through the establishment of a workers' republic. Its program stated, "The Workers' Party will centralize and direct the struggle of the laboring masses against the powerfully centralized opposition of their exploiters. It will courageously defend the workers and wage an aggressive struggle for the abolition of capitalism." The program also vigorously endorsed the Russian Revolution, which, it said, had ushered in a new period, the era of workers' republic. It demanded recognition of the Soviet government by the United States. It also called upon all workers to join the unions of their trade, to form minority groups of left-wing workers within the unions, to work for fighting programs in the organizations, and to depose the reactionary union leadership. The program condemned dual unionism and all ideas of destroying the old craft unions. It supported the amalgamation of the trade unions into industrial organizations. Under the heading of the race problem, the Workers' Party pledged to support the Negroes in their struggle for liberation, and for full equal ITY, and to destroy altogether the barriers of race prejudice in the unions. 75. The recognition of this special responsibility marked an important step forward. Although the Workers' Party was considered the legal party in the sense that it would be agitating for legal recognition as a party, the Communist Party of America was retained as the alternative, underground organization, should the former be suppressed. It must be remembered that the efforts at unity of the two main communist groups since 1919 were complicated by the constant federal and state attacks on the Dykels. This outlook was greatly influenced by the publication of V.I. Lenin's famous Left Wing, Communism, an Infantile Disorder, and by the formation of the Trade Union Educational League. Both will be discussed in the next volume. The split in the Socialist Party 255 and the foreign-born, especially the Communists. This continued practically unabated. In August 1922, the Communist Party of America held a convention in Bridgman, Michigan, to discuss the question of ending the underground party. After the majority group had voted against liquidation and the convention was about to disperse, FBI agents and agents from the state of Michigan raided the gathering. 17 delegates were arrested and charged with violating a Michigan law against criminal syndicalism. 76. Despite these developments, the move to establish a unified, legal Communist Party continued. In April 1923, the Workers' Party and the Communist Party of America were consolidated into the Workers' Party of America, thus bringing all communist groups under one roof. The Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party, both formed in 1919 and both affiliated with the Communist International, emerged in 1922-1923 from clandestine activity and persecution as the Workers' Party. In 1922, it had 12,394 members, and by 1923 the number reached more than 20,000.77. More than half of its membership was foreign-born. 78. Although small, it was an influential force in Finnish, Slavic and Jewish fraternal organizations, and, as we shall see in our next volume, in the unions of garment workers, coal miners, machinists and other groups of workers. Chapter 14. Political Action, 1918-1920. In his work, A Theory of the Labor Movement, published in 1928, in which he provided justification for the ideology of the AFL in the era of Gompersism, Selig Perlman advanced the thesis that the AFL survived, mainly because it knew how to resist the lure of politics. In resisting this lure, the AFL developed the doctrine called voluntarism, in which the leadership of the AFL rejected the state as a means of achieving trade union goals, and, in some cases, adopted even an extreme anti-state position. It was a philosophy in which the AFL leadership encouraged workers, mainly white skilled male labor, to improve their lot by developing the only source of power that counted: trade union formation. It was a philosophy which allowed the AFL reluctantly and mainly rhetorically to endorse legislation for female workers on the basis of their weakness, at the same time as it rejected social legislation in favor of collective bargaining. Opposing action in support of social insurance, Gompers explained, "Sore and sad as I am by the illness, the killing, the maiming of so many of my fellow workers, I would rather see that go on for years and years, minimized and mitigated by the organized labor movement, than give up one jot of freedom of the workers to strive and struggle for their own emancipation through their own efforts. Point 2. The AFL's de-emphasis on politics increased during the war. While for a defense of the AFL's doctrine of voluntarism, see William English Walling, American Labor and American Democracy, Volume I. New York, 1926, and George Higgins, U.J., on Tourism in Organized Labor in the United States, 1930 to 1940, Washington, 0. C. 1944. For an incisive critique of the doctrine, see Michael Rogan, 3. Voluntarism, The Political Functions of an Antipolitical Doctrine, Industrial and Labor Relations Review 15, July 1962. 52135. Political Action, 1918-1920-257. World War I brought AFL leaders into participation in government to an extent never before achieved. It also increased their participation with management. To Federation leaders, notes Michael Rogan, 3. The war experience taught the value not of government action but of union cooperation with industry. Their aggravated anxiety to win a place as the partners of industry made the Federation leaders even more opposed to state interference in labor-capital relations than they had been before the war. And they were definitely more opposed to independent political action. Forces for Independent Political AOION. On June 9, 1916, Samuel Gompers sent a packet of articles explaining the AFL's stand on political action to John Fitzpatrick, president of the Chicago Federation of Labor and an outspoken proponent of independent political action. The articles contained Gompers' political philosophy. First, avoid involvement in partisan politics and follow a policy of reward your friends and punish your enemies on the major party tickets. Second, refrain from independent political action at all costs. And third, subordinate political to economic action. I am sure, Gompers wrote, that with a fair reading and understanding of these documents, you will be in a position to meet any opponent or adverse critic of the trade union movement and justify upon every ground the fundamental work and principles, struggles, achievements and ideals of the American Federation of Labor. 4. Shortly after receiving this letter, Fitzpatrick intensified his activity for the formation of a Labor Party. By 1919, he had achieved the establishment of such a party, first in Chicago, and then in Illinois, and had even aided the formation of a Labor Party on a national scale. 5. Several factors contributed to this, such as the clear hostility to organized labor, and the growing confidence of reactionaries reflected especially in the open shop campaign frightened a number of union leaders who had relied up to then on the AFL's traditional political policies, and convinced them that a new political movement was essential to safeguard the labor movement. 6. A specific reason for this feeling was the increasing use of injunctions. Usually injunctions prohibited such activities as picketing, threatening, soliciting employees to join the strike, addressing to any employees words imparting hatred, criticism, censure, scorn, disgust, humiliation or annoyance because of their employment by the complainant, and distributing handbills, cards, or other printed matter among employees. 7. It is folly, wrote John P. Frey, editor of the International Molders Journal, to spend $50,000 or $100,000 in a strike, when a decision of the judge. 258. Postwar Struggles. 1918 to 1920 can overthrow all that strikers are able to accomplish. 8. As the use of injunctions increased during the strike wave of 1919, labor's anger mounted. Government by injunction will increase the growth of Bolshevism, warned the Columbia Labor News. 9. One of the 10 items in Labor's Bill of Rights was government by injunction. It read, "Government by injunction has grown out of the perversion of the injunction process. By the misuse of that process, workers have been forbidden to do those things which they have a natural and constitutional right to do. The injunction is now used as a revolutionary measure which substitutes government by judicial discretion or bias for government by law. It substitutes a trial by one man, a judge, in his discretion, for a trial by jury. This abuse of the injunction process undermines and destroys the very foundations of our free 10 MST 1 Tut 1 ons." Writing in Survey, John Fitch noted that the Tough Vale case, in Great Britain, led to the formation of the British Labour Party, the election of Labour representatives to Parliament, and the passage of the Trades Disputes Action which protected the unions from attacks in the courts. Labour in the United States had believed that the Clayton Antitrust Act would do the same, Fitch wrote, but the continuing repression of the right to strike by the courts proved that they were wrong. Was it not time for American labor to follow their British trade union brothers and move towards the formation of a Labour Party? 1. Actually, the success of the British Labour Party stimulated the movement for the Labour Party in the United States. In 1918, the British Labour Party increased its representation in Parliament from 39 to 59 seats, 12. The Bolshevik Revolution strengthened the movement for a labor party. To those who sought a new political movement for U.S. workers, the Russian Revolution symbolized the results labor could obtain by determined and united strength. Although John Fitzpatrick made it clear that the Labour Party movement, as he saw it, did not seek to overthrow the existing capitalist system, he insisted that it could learn much from the Bolshevik Revolution. Fitzpatrick expressed the hope that the day was only near when the workers would be able to concentrate their efforts and do a job such as Russia has done. 13. The Labour Party movement got underway before the armistice. The first attempt was made at Bridgeport, Connecticut, in September 1918, during the machinists' strike against the award of the National War Labor Board. President Wilson's use of executive power to force the arms and munitions workers back to work induced the strikers to enter politics. On Political Action, 1918-1920-259. September 6, the Bridgeport workers established the American Labor Party as an instrument of industrial emancipation, and adopted a platform similar to the British Labour Party's manifesto, I Abhor and the New Social Order. 14. Before the year was out, agitation for independent political action by labor had spread to 45 cities across the nation. This labor thing is breaking out in many places, Frank P. Walsh, the Foner chairman of the War Labor Board, wrote at the end of 1918. The home of it is the Chicago Federation of Labor, the most intelligent and honest radical group in the country. 15. The Chicago Program. The Chicago Federation of Labor was a traditional stronghold of labor insurgency. It had tried to form a labor party in 1905, 1906, 1908, and again in 1910, and it had continually campaigned for municipal ownership of public resources and utilities. The sponsorship of successful wartime drives in meatpacking and the needle trades established the Chicago Federation as the most vigorous city central of the AFL in 1919. Under President John Fitzpatrick and his associates, Edward Nockels, Duncan MacDonald, and John C. Walker, Chicago and Illinois were the hub of the Labor Party effort. 16. Barely a month after the armistice, the Chicago Federation declared, "The time is ripe. A new day has dawned. An opportunity that comes but once in a lifetime is presented," the Chicago trade unionists exclaimed. Labor in Chicago and labor in all other centers of America will join with their brothers and sisters of other lands under the slogan, "All Power 10 the Workers." The hour of the people has come. 17. The Chicago Federation then called on workers to support the movement for a mass labor party and presented what came to be called the Chicago Program. Part of it was Labor's 14 Points, published by the Chicago Federation of Labor on November 17, 1918. Named in obvious imitation of President Wilson's program, it provided a platform for independent political action. Labor, it pointed out, wished to increase its voice in society and to counterbalance private interests or bureaucratic agents of government. It could do this only by achieving its rights to organize and bargain collectively, to work an 8-hour day for a minimum wage, and to expect equal treatment for men and women in industry and government. 260. Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920, mining the methods, policies, and programs of public education, and a League of Workers as a supplement to the League of Nations to guarantee disarmament and to maintain or work toward open diplomacy and peace. Labor's 14 Points called upon the government to abolish unemployment through public works projects during depression periods, to lower the cost of living by controlling profiteering in all phases of production and distribution, to extend soldiers' and sailors' insurance, including accident and illness insurance, to all citizens, to expedite the payment of the war debt by taxing inheritance incomes and land values, and to restore free speech, free assemblage and the free press. Finally, it called upon the government to nationalize and develop the nation's natural resources and provide for public ownership of public utilities, and signify cantly the democratic management of industry and commerce. 18. The Cook County Labor Party. The Cook County Labor Party was organized on December 29, 1918, and less than a month later, it nominated John Fitzpatrick for mayor of Chicago. Fitzpatrick ran on a platform which was organized to establish genuine democracy in all public affairs, by breaking the power of RAPAC's public utility corporations, greedy big business interests and reactionary newspapers which now dominate our civic life. Big businessmen was held responsible for high gas bills, exorbitant elevated and surface car transportation charges, an anti-labor school board, anti-strike police department and courts, high taxes for the poor, and the distortions of truth in the Chicago daily papers. To correct these inequities, the party demanded municipal ownership and operation of all public utilities, democracy in the public education system, full recognition of union labor in all departments of city government, shorter hours for city workers, abolition of the contract system in public projects, and the neutrality of the police in industrial disputes. It called upon the municipality to clear the slums and inaugurate public housing projects, and to improve sanitation by electrifying steam railways in order to eliminate dust, by regularizing garbage collection, and by building playgrounds and forest preserves. The city should also readjust the tax system to place a greater burden on the wealthy. Home rule for Chicago was also demanded, so that the people of this city may settle their local problems and manage their local government without outside interference. The initiative, referendum and recall were to be instituted as a final check upon the government. Fitzpatrick pledged to conduct a vigorous campaign, to uphold the general goals of the party and to accept no contributions from businessmen. Political action, 1918-1920-261 are those who have personal ambitions, which he maintained were nothing else but blood money ground out of the lives of the toilers. The Cook County Labor Party concentrated exclusively on gaining labor support. It conducted its activities mainly through local unions, and speakers appeared before as many meetings as possible to explain the party program. Fitzpatrick addressed a meeting of 5,000 members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, received the personal endorsement of Sidney Hillman and accepted a $500 donation to his campaign fund. Before a meeting of 8,000 workers, Frank Walsh similarly endorsed Fitzpatrick's candidacy. 19. Although concentrating on the unions, the Labor Party leaders made a special appeal to the returning veterans. A resolution was adopted by the party to select a committee of soldiers, sailors, and workingmen to deal with the problems of the returned soldiers and sailors, and to promote their cooperation with the workers of Chicago for the advancement of political and industrial democracy at home. 20. The Labor Herald of Kansas City, Missouri reported that the trade unionists of Chicago are enthusiastic over the new party and declare that they will win the election. The old-line politicians are worried over the action of the workers in getting into the political arena and will do their utmost to defeat the ticket. 2-1. Although the Cook County Labor Party campaigned vigorously, Fitzpatrick received only 55,990 votes, or 8% of the total, compared with the 37% received by the victorious Republicans. The Labor Party explained its low vote by insisting that it was cheated at the polls, that it received unfair treatment at the hands of the Chicago press, and that it had encountered hostility from local unions that refused to break with traditional AFL political policies. However, it did point out that the Labor Party had replaced the Socialists as the third party in Chicago, and Fitzpatrick concluded that the party has established itself on the map. It has come to stay. 22. During the first week of December, 1918, a resolution was adopted at the convention of the Illinois Federation of Labor to form an independent Labor Party for the state of Illinois. 23. A referendum of the affiliated unions on the resolution showed 341 organizations in favor and 38 against. Of individual votes recorded, 22,722 were for and 2,561 against. 24. In April 1919, at a state convention, the Labor Party of Illinois was formed. It adopted Labor's 14 points as its platform, and in addition passed a resolution expressing its desire to place on record a statement of appreciation of the great service rendered to the cause of labor by the 262 Postwar Struggles, 1918-1920. Socialist movement by its campaign of education carried on so vigorously and at such noble sacrifice, and we urgently invite all socialists who see larger hope for the workers through the plans of the Labor Party to come into this party and become fellow workers with us. 25. The American Labor Party. On January 1, 1919, the Joint Reconstruction Committees of the Central Labor Bodies of Greater New York called a convention of trade union representatives for the purpose of organizing a labor party. There were 884 delegates present representing the Central Federated Union, the Central Labor Union of Brooklyn, the Women's Trade Union League and the United Hebrew Trades, as well as delegates from 152 local and 41 international unions. The convention organized the American Labor Party of Greater New York. 26. The new party's program was similar in many respects to that of the British Labour Party. Besides demanding a restoration of free speech, it called for the democratic control of industry and commerce by those who work by hand and brain, and the elimination of autocratic domination of the forces of production either by selfish private interests or bureaucratic agents of government, the equitable sharing of the proceeds among all who participate in any capacity and only among these. 27. The Constitution of the American Labor Party of New York provided that no candidate of the Labor Party shall accept endorsement of either the Democratic or the Republican parties nor of any other parties that stand for private ownership of public utilities. Nor shall the Labor Party endorse any candidates of the above-mentioned parties. This, one observer noted, allowed an endorsement of its candidates by the Socialist Party and vice versa. 28. Labor parties appeared elsewhere, and by mid-1919, there were statewide organizations in Indiana, Pennsylvania, Kansas, Iowa, Idaho, Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, California, and Montana, as well as the two main centers of independent political action, Illinois and New York. 23 states had labor parties in 1920, with particularly strong ones in New York, Pennsylvania and Indiana. The movement gained the backing of the brewery workers, cigar makers, bricklayers, carpenters, painters, molders, bakers, quarry workers, glass workers, machinists with a membership of 331,000, men's and women's clothing workers with 250,000 members, the United Mine Workers with 400,000 members, and the 16 unions comprising the Railroad Brotherhoods of America, with 1.65 million members. In fact, the Labor Party movement was substantial. Political action, 1918-1920-263 enough to prompt Wisconsin's progressive Senator Robert M. La Follette to seriously consider the party's presidential nomination in 1920.29. The Committee of 48. The move for a national labor party began as early as January 1919 with the formation of the Committee of 48, composed of Eastern liberals and businessmen and promoted by the New Republic. 30. The plan was to organize a political movement like the British Labour Party, to keep in constant touch with local labor parties, lining up trade unionists and men outside of organized labor, single taxers, bull moosers, nonpartisan leaguers and the like, and then merge into one effective political instrument when the time was ripe. 28. To that end, the Committee of 48 recruited about 250,000 members in 1919. Although only 10,000 were active, distributed almost 1 million pieces of propaganda and set up organizations in more than a dozen states, with headquarters in Chicago. 3. It adopted a 3-point platform that called for the restoration of all civil liberties, a single tax, public ownership and democratic management of the means of transportation and communication, mines, finance, and all monopolies and natural resources. 32. The Committee of 48 believed that political action through a labor party which could unite organized labor and its allies was a real possibility. In fact, a survey by the New York Times in December 1919 revealed that an alliance between organized labor, middle-class professionals, and farmers was the talk of the people generally throughout the Middle West. 33. The Nonpartisan League. The most important of these potential allies was the Nonpartisan League, created by socialists in North Dakota who realized that the exploitation of the state's farmers by grain dealers, banks, and railroads had enraged innumerable lifelong Republicans. The remedy envisaged by Arthur C. Townley and Arthur Le Sueur was to enter the Republican primaries with a disciplined organization of farmers and workers. The key to their approach was local meetings at which everyone who paid $1 could help select one of their number for NPL endorsement in the primaries, a platform calling for state-owned banks, grain elevators and other marketing agencies, to which candidates were pledged, and a disciplined caucus of elected members. 34. 264. Postwar Struggles, 1918-1920 were in the NPL caucus. The 1919 session, we the NPL controlled both houses as well as Governor Lynn Frazier, created a state bank, grain elevators, hail insurance, workmen's compensation, income and inheritance taxes, home buyers assistance, restrictions on injunctions and strikes, and the country's best mine safety law. 35. The successes of the Nonpartisan League of North Dakota had an important effect on farmers in other areas. The League organizations gradually began to spread to all the neighboring states. In 1917, the National Nonpartisan League was founded, setting itself the task of uniting the efforts of all the local League organizations. By the end of 1918, the national organization had 188,365 members. By 1920, it had reached 235,000.36. In 1917, in one of his speeches, Townley said, "The farmers control 35% of the vote of this country. Labor controls about 27%. A combination of these two elements would make itself felt throughout the nation." In a number of the League's rural constituencies, the idea of a new party which would unite farmers and workers was opposed. Instead, they favored continuing to rely on controlling the primaries. But others, especially the labor sections of the League, believed they would benefit from a new party. They moved toward independent political action, convinced that the time was ripe for it. 37. A national labor party. In the summer of 1919, the Committee of 48, led by Herbert Crowley, Amos Pinchot and Dudley Field Malone, issued a call summoning, from all parts of the country, the leaders of its liberal thought and its forward-looking citizens to meet in conference. It was hoped that, from this assemblage of hitherto scattered forces for Americanism will come a flexible statement of principles and methods that will permit effective cooperation with organized labor and agricultural workers in the task of social reconstruction. 38. What actually did come from the meeting was a national labor party. Late in November 1919, 1,200 delegates representing trade unions and labor party organizations, as well as non-labor 5 groups such as single taxers, farmers and intellectuals met in Chicago. 9. The labor delegates were men who advocated industrial organization, the nationalization of industry and comprehensive social insurance. Political action, 1918-1920-265 ICAL policy of the AFL had been 30 years of failure and had demonstrated that we cannot deliver to the Democrats, we cannot deliver to the Republicans, and we cannot deliver to the Socialists. Now we have a right to see if we can deliver to ourselves. To John Fitzpatrick, the conference was an opportunity for labor that comes but once in a lifetime, to become a political force on its own account and for the benefit of the working people and their families. 41. The unions present at the conference included the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers, Fur Workers, Brewery Workers, Quarry Workers, Glass Workers, Bakers, Painters, Miners, Machinists, Cigar Makers, Printers and Tailors, and the state federations of Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, Kansas and Wisconsin. Labor parties represented were those recently established in Illinois, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, South Dakota and Kansas. All of the unions represented had expressed admiration for the British Labour Party, and most had passed convention resolutions in the past 2 years labeling the AFL-Polit-ICAL program a miserable failure, and wanting independent political action on the part of hand and brain workers. 2. The National Constituent Convention of the National Labor Party opened in Chicago on November 22. Max Hayes of the International Typographical Union and John H. Walker and Frank Esper of the United Mine Workers were chosen chairman, vice chairman and secretary, respectively, of the convention. 43 inches labor, the convention declared, is the primary and just basis of political responsibility and power. It is not merely the right but the duty of workers of hand and brain to become a party. The convention voted to participate in the coming presidential elections, deferring the nomination of candidates until 1920. The name of the new organization was to be the Labor Party of the United States. Its object was to organize all brain and hand workers in support of the principle of political, social and industrial democracy. 44. Although the convention deferred presidential nominations and the adoption of a platform until 1920, it did adopt a declaration of principles which emphasized many of the same points as the Chicago Federation of Labor platform, but was even more advanced than that document. For example, it affirmed the need to nationalize the basic industries, transport, until the summer of 1920. When it adopted the name Farmer Labor Party, it variously called itself American Labor Party, U.S. Labor Party, and National Labor Party. Stanley Shapiro. Hand and Braun. The Farmer Labor Party of 1920, Labor History 26, Sunner 1985. 413 n. 266. Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920 and the Entire Basic System. It also called for the democratization of the American political system by revising the Constitution, granting the POPLE the right to legislative initiative and the right to recall elected congressmen and substantially reducing the power of the Supreme Court, including the abrogation of its right to declare laws unconstitutional. Among specific demands of particular interest to labor were the demand for wages sufficient to enable workers to maintain themselves in good health and comfort, the abolition of unemployment through the further reduction of the hours of labor and through government activity during times of industrial depression, and the establishment of health, old age and maternity insurance and workmen's compensation throughout the country. 45. Aside from the platforms of the Socialist and Communist parties, the Declaration of Principles of the National Labor Party was clearly one of the most advanced documents of the period. The Boston Herald called it Bolshevik in principle, but the newspaper drew comfort from the fact that, radical as some of these declarations were, the convention voted down resolutions calling for the establishment of a Soviet government in the United States, and recommending the abolition of the Supreme Court. 46. As for the formation of the National Labor Party itself, the Nashville Tennessean observed, "There is no reason why we should become excited over this movement. It is a symptom of the industrial unrest from which we are rapidly passing. The ideals which animate its sponsors will be dead within a year, and with the return of pre-war prosperity there will be no cause for the body's existence." 47. But the socialist Cleveland Citizen disagreed. Those who assembled at Chicago burned their bridges behind them, it insisted, and inaugurated a campaign that will not end until the Labor Party is in complete control of the machinery of government and incorporates its principles into the laws of the land. 48. The new majority, official organ of the Chicago Labor Party and adopted by the convention as the official organ of the National Labor Party, also declared, it may not elect a president in 1920. This looks like a Republican year. But with the Democrats out of the way it should organize in 4 years so effectively that it can capture the government of the United States for the workers of factory and farm in 1924. By the peaceful process of storming the ballot box. It should send a few members to Congress at the coming election. It should see aid to raise state and local governments in many localities within the next 2 years. 9. Political action, 1918-1920-267. The workers are through with the old parties, new majority boldly asserted. The Republican Party had always been the party of hateful, merciless exploitation of the wage earners, both organized and unorganized, while the Democratic Party, within the last few years, has shown how far it will go to grind its heel into the face of the workers when the bosses of big business crack the whip. The result was inevitable. Labor, organized and unorganized, labor of the farm as well as of the shop, has leapt to the fray for political war to the death with the crooks who rule this country by subsidizing its two old political parties in order that they may maintain their iron rule of industry and commerce from which they gorge themselves with profits that they cannot spend, consigning the workers to poverty. 50. The Farmer Labor Party. Immediately after its founding convention, the National Labor Party launched a campaign to publicize its existence and its declaration of principles. Its appeals met with response among workers and farmers. New labor parties emerged in Iowa, Nebraska and Wyoming. In Minnesota, with the support of the State Federation of Labor, a labor's nonpartisan league was founded to become a sort of urban branch of the Farmers' Nonpartisan League. Minnesota was the ideal setting for a farmer-labor alliance. Minneapolis was the site of the hated grain exchange, of flour milling and farm machinery. St. Paul and Duluth were manufacturing and shipping centers. The Mesabi Iron Range was peopled with militant miners from Finland, Croatia, Italy and the Ukraine as well as native-born Americans. Even the countryside was spotted with railroad junctions and meat-packing towns. Here the Farmer Labor Party slogan found supporters among leading figures in the National Nonpartisan League who were not satisfied to rely only on dominating the primaries of the major parties. 51. Early in 1920, the National Labor Party began making preparations for its second convention. It hoped to achieve unity with a number of radical farmers' organizations and to proclaim the formation of a farmer labor party. The Second Labor Party convention opened on July 1, 1920 in Chicago. In his keynote address, Fitzpatrick upbraided those who should have been the natural allies of labor in the new party movement but were not prepared to break with the existing major parties. He predicted that they would soon see the wisdom of independent political action. When that happened, he went on, nothing would be able to prevent the present renderers of useful service in America from taking the reins out of the 268 Postwar Struggles, 1918 to 1920 hands of the men and women who controlled the national and international financial structures. What was involved in the new party movement, Fitzpatrick insisted, was a simple case of men, women and children against greed, gold and avarice. But unity did not come easily. The Committee of 48 was holding its own convention in Chicago at precisely the same time, and there was considerable sentiment there for the formation of a farmer labor party. When it became clear that some of the committee's leaders were against this, the rank-and-file delegates made their feelings clear by joining the convention of the Labor Party. Once they were at the Labor Party's convention, the Committee of 48 delegates clashed with the Labor delegates over the party's declaration of principles. They objected to the demand for the nationalization of the basic industries. For the sake of preserving unity, Labor Party representatives agreed to concessions. While endorsing public ownership of the major industries like railroads, with an especially vigorous endorsement of the Plum Plan, coal mines, hydroelectric power plants, grain elevators, and telegraph and telephone, the party platform did not include a general demand for the nationalization of the basic industries. Having achieved this, the delegates from the Committee of 48 ceased their opposition. However, most of the delegates from the Nonpartisan League withdrew, led by Governor Fraser of North Dakota, after the convention went on record for the nationalization of unused land. 52. A number of delegates also left when the convention decided to keep hands off the prohibition issue. Prohibition had been instituted on January 16, 1920 with the ratification of the 18th Amendment barring the manufacture, sale or transportation of intoxicating liquors. At a meeting in opposition to the proposed amendment, held in New York City's Madison Square Garden on May 24, 1919, Federated Union President Edward I. Hanna urged workers to go first to the Republicans and Democrats for a redress of their grievances against the Prohibition Amendment. If the traditional parties refused to help, he urged, then come to an American Labor Party. But when the Labor Party also refused its aid, the wet delegates left in anger. 53. Many unions were bitterly opposed to prohibition, especially those whose very existence was threatened by it. There was even a strong movement for a general strike in a number of cities and states if beer was prohibited, but Gompers and other AFL leaders opposed it. R greater than RA discussion of this issue. See Newalla McGann Drexler. Organized Labor and the 18th Amendment, Labor History 8, Fall 1967, 280-99. Political Action, 1918-1920-269. Despite these withdrawals, the convention proceeded to organize the Foner Labor Party of the United States. It adopted a platform and nominated candidates for the forthcoming presidential election. Even with the concession to the Committee of 48, the Farmer Labor Party platform was an advanced document. It included demands for the recognition of Soviet Russia and the cessation of intervention against it, for recognition of the principle of self-determination for all oppressed nations, for democratization of the American political system, and for equal rights for Negroes. Basically, the Labor Party forces were strong enough to withstand the efforts of the Committee of 48 and other liberal reformers to water down the FLP platform. 54. Governor Frazier of North Dakota, a leading figure in the nonpartisan League, was reported to be the first choice for a presidential nominee of the new party. However, after his withdrawal from the convention, representatives of the Committee of 48 and some farmer delegates urged the convention to ask Senator Robert M. LaFollette to head the FLP ticket, but nothing came of this. In the end, the delegates chose Parker Christensen, an attorney in Salt Lake City, as the party candidate for president and Max S. Hayes as his running mate. John Fitzpatrick was nominated for senator from Illinois. Christensen was a Utah lawyer who had gained a reputation with labor unions for his defense of trade unionism. Hayes was a Cleveland socialist and had to resign from the Socialist Party in order to accept the nomination. 55. Lacking funds and strong local organizations in many parts of the country, the Farmer Labor Party was handicapped from the very outset, but the 265,000 votes Christensen received was even less than expected. Fitzpatrick pulled only 50,749 in Illinois, and only 4,760 of these came from Cook County. In Chicago, the Socialists replaced the Labor Party as the third party, which accounted for the small vote Fitzpatrick received in the city. Most of his vote came from minors downstate. 6. In the state of Washington, the Democrats had been reduced to insignificance in the September primaries and the Republicans in the farmer Laborites were the major contenders in the presidential and gubernatorial election of November 1920. With little money for campaigning, inadequate newspaper support, and labeled by the state's powerful newspapers as disloyal, radical, subversive, and un-American, the Farmer Labor Party faced incredible odds. Although the Farmer Laborites were engulfed by the Republican Party, they captured a majority of the labor vote. 7. 270. Postwar Struggles. 1918 to 1920. Gompers and the Labor Party movement. The 1920 returns for the Foner Labor Party may have disappointed the militants, but they made Gompers jubilant. He called the farmer labor experiment neither farmer nor labor, but merely a combination of foolishness and presumption. 58. As far as he was concerned, the returns fully justified the warning he had given those who favored a Labor Party. Addressing a labor conference in New York City on December 8, 1918 before leaving for the peace treaty meeting in Europe, Gompers had entitled his speech, "Should a political labor party be formed?" His answer was that, in view of the history of such ventures in both the United States and Europe, such a move should not even be considered. He insisted that all of these experiments, with no exception, had failed, and where some successes seemed to have attended their efforts, as in the case of some European countries, the trade union movement had found itself saddled with political issues which were often detrimental to labor's cause. The AFL's tried and proven policy of nonpartisan political action, Gompers concluded, was the only effective path for labor to follow in the political arena. 59. Gompers continued his attack on the idea of a labor party after the party became a reality in the fall of 1919. He brought pressure to bear on labor leaders of the AFL who espoused the Labor Party cause. A few days after the launching of the National Labor Party in December 1919, Gompers called a conference to mobilize support for the traditional nonpartisan policy. 89 national and international unions affiliated with the AFL, together with the 4 railroad brotherhoods, were represented. The conference chose a special, nonpartisan campaign committee, composed of the AFL Executive Council and the heads of its departments. One scholar has called this the most extensive political campaign in the history of the AFL to defeat the legislative enemies of the workers and elect its friends. 60. But the principal motive behind the conference seems to have been to take the wind out of the Labor Party's sails. It was with justification that the new majority, the organ of the Labor Party, declared, "The AFL is trying to scare everyone to death who dares to rise up and oppose its political ideas." 61. Gompers also took more direct steps. The Central Federated Union of New York had endorsed the Labor Party by referendum. Gompers thereupon induced the Brooklyn Central Labor Union to withdraw its support and to maneuver to bring about the abandonment of the CFU's endorsement. By a vote of 22 to 18, conservatives in the CFU carried a motion repudiating the earlier endorsement of the Labor Party and supporting the Political Action, 1918 to 1920 nonpartisan policy of the AFL. 62,271. When the Indiana Labor Party dared to criticize the AFL's nonpartisan political policy after it had been sharply criticized by Gompers, the AFL Executive Council publicly and bitterly rebuked it. "By what right do you assume to declare the work and the policy of the American Federation of Labor to be impractical? Surely the results achieved in the interests of the workers demonstrate the utter fallacy of your assumption. Your telegram is an affront to the labor movement and an assault upon the interests of that great body of Americans who are determined that the present campaign shall result, not in the destruction of our liberties, but in the opening of the way to national progress and the achievement of opportunities for human welfare, safety and happiness. 63. The Chicago Federation of Labor immediately came to the support of the Indiana Labor Party and replied, Mr. Gompers and the Executive Council have confessed again and again the futility and failure of the defeat your friends and reward your enemies, plan whereby Mr. Gompers seeks again to juggle the labor vote around between the old parties. 64. The Railroad Brotherhoods. The sad experience of the Railroad Brotherhoods in Congress with respect to the Plum Plan roused the normally conservative chiefs of the rail unions to action. In response to the crisis, 16 of these leaders met late in 1919 with the leaders of the United Mine Workers and agreed to a program of political action demanding the nationalization of both the coal mines and the railroads. However, they also decided to neither establish nor endorse a labor party. Instead, they would use the direct primary to elect sympathetic senators and representatives. The 600 branches of the Plum Plan League provided the nucleus for an organization that would intervene in the primaries to defeat the movement's enemies and nominate and elect its friends. 65. Thus, the Labor Party movement's labor elements consisted largely of those members of the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods who opposed the policy of nonpartisan political action. On the other hand, the top leaders of the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods devoted nearly all of their time in 1920 to the nonpartisan campaign. The philosophy behind the campaign, of course, was not new. It was much the same as it had been ever since the AFL's first efforts along this line in 1906. The defeat of the enemies of the people and the election of their friends. In 1920, however, the actual words were, reward our friends and defeat our enemies. 272. Post-war struggles, 1918 to 1920. The campaign was organized more thoroughly. In January, at the request of the AFL Executive Council, Gompers established the National Non-Partisan Campaign Platform Committee, and in March, it was made a permanent standing committee of the Federation. 66. A month later, each local union of the AFL was asked to appoint a committee of 3 to work in harmony with the central labor body committees in their localities in the forthcoming presidential campaign. Circulars such as Legislative Achievements of the AFL and 40 Years of Action, Nonpartisan Political Policy of the American Federation of Labor were mailed to all union members, as well as letters of instructions on how to vote. At the Washington office of the AFL, 55 tions relating to issues of interest to labor were drawn up, and both the Democratic and Republican platform committees were requested to answer them. 67. Although neither party's answers were exactly what the AFL was looking for, Gompers concluded in a letter he mailed to the editors of all major newspapers on July 13. In summarizing, it is fair to say that the Democratic platform marks a measure of progress not found in the platform of the Republican Party. In relation to labor's proposals, the planks written into the Democratic platform more nearly approximate the desired declarations of human rights than do the planks found in the Republican platform. 68. The AFL, the RR Brotherhoods and the 1920 election. In the columns of the American Federationist, Gompers was even more definite in his opposition to the Republican Party. The Republican Party, in its platform declarations and through the political character of the candidates nominated, he wrote, has taken its position as an unqualified defender of the enemies of labor. 69. As for the presidential candidates Warren G. Harding, Republican, and James M. Cox, Democrat, Gompers observed, there can be but one conclusion based upon a careful and impartial survey of the actions and declarations of the candidates. Governor Cox has shown himself possessed of a fuller understanding of the needs and of the problems of the industrial world. 70. As the national campaign entered its final months, the AFL support for the Democratic PCU-1Y and its presidential candidate became even more pronounced. Meanwhile, however, the Railroad Brotherhoods had decided to political action 1918-1920-273 concentrate on the congressional rather than the presidential campaign. In July 1920, the 16 heads of the railroad unions issued a call to political action. It is of paramount importance, declared the preamble, that a progressive Congress be elected, because the powers of wealth and privilege will fight even more bitterly to elect a privilege-controlled Congress than a reactionary president. 71. The railroad chiefs also chose a campaign committee to help elect U-friendly congressmen and to defeat anyone who had voted for the Transportation Act, and in particular its authors Representative John J. Esch of Wisconsin and Senator Albert Cummins of Iowa. After such extensive efforts by the AFL and the Railroad Brotherhoods, the results of the November voting must have been as disappointing to the officials of the Federation and the Brotherhoods as to the leaders of the Farmer Labor Party. Governor Cox was able to garner only 34 1% of the total popular vote, resulting in a most decisive victory for Harding. Esch was defeated, but the attempt to defeat Cummins narrowly failed. Moreover, while Labour eliminated a number of its worst enemies from Congress, it elected few of its friends. Even Gompers admitted that not more than 50 representatives out of 435 could be relied upon as friends of Labour. 72. Having helped to weaken the movement for Labour's independent political action, Gompers had approached the 1920 election with a good deal of enthusiasm. "It is to be a wonderful campaign," he wrote to a Labour official in March 1920, "something that will go down as a memorable milestone in the history of Labour." 73. When the ballots were tabulated, however, Labour's headline read, "Big Business Grabs Presidency, Senate and House," and the lead article of the American Federationist appeared under the caption, "Reaction in the Saddle." 74. The Farmer Labor Party, organized at the end of the First World War, never recovered from the debacle of the 1920 election. But as we shall see in our next volume, the idea of independent political action by Labour, the idea of a national farmer labor party, did not die.